Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 306 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on July 4th, 2026. This is the official podcast for the fan site avatarthelastairbender.online.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's podcast, we are going to go over some news from the past kind of couple of weeks, mostly the big ones. And then we will also start some of our Netflix Avatar Season 2 coverage. We're actually going to do episode 1 and 2 together today, just because we kind of need to get it done here before it looks like everything's going to happen for Avatar Studios starting from SDCC. So we kind of need to get through that sort of stuff. But yeah, let's get into the news here. We will start with this. This is from, at this point, nearly a month ago. It was kind of somewhat just after like the last podcast that we did. Brian Konietzko sort of broke the silence when it came to like official statements about Avatar Studios and said some very interesting things. Kind of said exactly what I think we needed to hear. So let's go over this kind of post here, and this will relate to sort of other bits of news that we talk about as well. So he posted some of the Book 3 soundtrack images that he kind of worked on, but what he then kind of transitions into is that the image, so Zuko kind of in the middle of everything, fire all around him, this doubles as an illustration of me. Behind the scenes every day, working on new Avatar content, fighting for the Avatar franchise, dealing with the messes left over by thieves, not always at liberty to air our business and my grievances on social media. Despite what anyone without actual knowledge may be chirping about, that big video game, the premise of which I came up with, wasn't cancelled. Did it experience a big setback? Yep. These things are not easy. None of this is. Will it ever happen? Hopefully. Will it be better because of the reset? If I have anything to do with it, most definitely. Is that all frustrating for you and me? Yep. But if you can ignore the chatter and hang in there a bit longer, we'll have lots of official news to share soon. Hope to see you at SDCC. Friends, lots of love. Brian, and it's like fire, fire, heart, fire, kind of disgruntled face, heart, fire, fire, fire. So classic kind of Brian here, but a bit of a kind of fiery, kind of a little bit of passion in this post here, addressing some stuff, with people I think appreciating the idea that it seems like he maybe kind of said stuff when potentially he maybe wasn't meant to or allowed to say it, but we needed this like a couple of weeks ago. We really badly needed kind of confirmation of just stuff happening, and him just kind of confirming to us that, okay, big news, official news is coming soon, mentioning SDCC. Okay, confirmation ahead of anything being confirmed about SDCC that we are actually going to get news here. But what was your reaction to this kind of out of the blue Brian post?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, very much appreciated by people who are into the franchise and are following sort of the threads of things going on. This does really feel sort of like on brand. This feels like, we've gotten posts before, like, around quarter time and other sort of downtime from the creators where they, try to reach out as much as they can within, the confines of, their contracts and stuff like that. So I think it's definitely good. It definitely does sort of, give some hope, that's sort of, the idea behind the franchise and everything. So, there is, it works in sort of brand with what they've created and sort of how, the ethos of the show in general. So it is very much appreciated and does give us something to look forward to, SDCC, which I think, most people had sort of presumed that is where, a lot of information would be coming from, considering sort of the readjustment of timelines of things. So no, I think it definitely helped. And, this was a couple of weeks ago. So, there was sort of a, just yet another sort of like dead period of time of people sort of wondering and sort of, bemoaning sort of the state of things in the franchise. So it's definitely nice to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting stuff here. The dealing with messes left over by thieves is clearly a reference to the leak of the movie. Not going into it in a ton of detail, but highlighting that, yes, it has created a mess behind the scene, the scenes that they have to kind of deal with, and they're still dealing with. Mm-hmm. we're going to see, I guess, at SDCC how they handle that, and we have a piece of news that we'll go over that might relate to that. Highlighting that, yeah, like they're fighting constantly for this, which maybe gives maybe not the best impression of Paramount behind the scenes, but I think if you've ever heard interviews with Mike and Brian, you know that everything Avatar, all these productions are always a bit of a kind of battlefield type thing. So that's not like crazy. It's not like this to me from Brian doesn't come across as something like absolutely crazy is going on behind the scenes. This is just multiple animation projects at the same time is probably a just crazy environment, and that's kind of normal for Avatar. And it's just because of the lack of communication that is causing a lot of problems. But it's interesting that it seems like what kind of almost like forced his hand in, it's almost a bit random that this is the thing that forced him to come out and say something, was that most of the post is about basically a rebuttal, a counter to a big IGN piece of news that came out, which was effectively that the AAA Avatar game, Ice Wars, was dead. And this came out very shortly after that, and so he's highlighting that, no, that game's not cancelled. It did experience a giant setback, and to a certain degree, like it has gone back to zero almost, but it's not completely dead. He really wants to kind of clarify that. So we still don't know what the full situation there is, but that's the kind of point there. It's a little bit of a weird post because like IGN's article did include like a quote from someone at Paramount Game Studios, so it's not like Paramount are just saying like sources told us this. It's like, no, a guy literally said this exact thing. But he wants to clarify this, even though, again, this pretty much resets the game back to kind of zero, and we probably are not going to hear anything about this until like 2029 at this point or something like that. What are your thoughts on that? Just the information on the Ice Wars game, and that's what he really wants to clarify in the middle of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it feels like that was something that, he was, very sort of involved with. Like, we had that sort of concept art, and like we knew a bit about what was potentially going to be in this game. But this, the article and everything sort of, like you said, it essentially sort of resets it, which, I get the idea of that, it's not completely like, never going to be a thing at this time, maybe, but for all intents and purposes, it is pretty much sort of gone, or completely back to zero, because of how the structure of the company works now, and the mergers and everything like that, and how things essentially get pushed to the wayside when a new set of people come in and have to sort of run things again. So it definitely is unfortunate, because people were really looking forward to it. To get that sort of type of game is, something that many fans have been wanting for in sort of like a modern format, right? Like, we have the fighting game, but even that had its own sort of struggles, even though that's sort of, coming out in some of the beta weekend as of right now. So, there's a lot of process to it. And yeah, it would be a very long time if we ever see anything about this going forward here. And I don't know, honestly, that kind of makes sense. Like, usually, you don't hear about video games when they're in the concepting stage. Like, it's very sort of rare, especially not for like a bigger company. A lot of indie teams and school, companies will do that sort of thing, especially if they're like going into early access, or, they're doing sort of a beta, or they have a demo already set up for it. But for bigger games, that's very rare. So it was kind of unique that we even knew about Ice Wars to begin with, but that feels like it's sort of one of the just the issues that we have with the franchise in general, where we're sort of getting information about things very early, and then we have to wait extremely long to actually see anything about it, which, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, that is the crazy thing about this game, is that, like, compared to, like, the whole Seven Havens thing, and the fact that we still don't have official information on the movie, and it's theoretically out in weeks, is kind of crazy. But they were telling us about this Ice Wars game when it had a like theoretical 2028 release date, is what they were realistically telling us. Yeah, what went on here that they just randomly decided to drop that piece of information above like everything else? And I guess the kind of miscommunication here is probably the difference between Brian, of course, is going to be involved in the very early concept stages of the game, whereas I guess Paramount Game Studios view that as being like, that game doesn't truly exist yet, and that's the main kind of like difference there. As for what specifically has happened here, I think the speculation most people have is like, are we switching developers kind of behind the scenes? Is that maybe what's happened here? Because I think, what was it? It was Saber Interactive it was announced for.
Yeah.
But they have like so many other games they're working on, and it feels like, do you have the time and ability to do this? So I'm wondering if that's what happened, because that's kind of basically what happened with the fighting game, and you're kind of wondering if the same thing's happening here. But either way, that is the situation there. We'll get into some of the other info first, and then we'll kind of wrap back around to the idea of news at Comic-Con. So the news from just like 2 days ago is that Paramount Plus Brazil, so the Brazilian Paramount Plus official account, posted randomly, they posted the July schedule for Paramount Plus in Portuguese, and on that schedule was a bunch of things, and on the 25th, so scheduled in for the 25th of July was Avatar: Aang the Last Airbender film. And this was obviously kind of major news because as far as we're aware right now, the movie has a fall 2026 release date. That's what they've been going with. So July 25th is completely new. And so this got obviously people talking because, are they just going to drop it randomly in a couple of weeks? Wait, that date is right in the middle of Comic-Con, which is the 23rd to the 26th, so that's the Saturday of the convention. Does this mean they're going to drop this as like their big announcement during one of the panels? That's what would make sense. Now, they immediately, it seems like, deleted this post, and it seems like probably because of this Aang movie information, because it's the one thing that like there was no information out there on. So what's happened here? It's the usual thing when news gets reported on, but then the source gets deleted, is like, was it just blatantly wrong information, or was it posted too soon? And so that's the discussion that we've kind of been having here, because it's not unreasonable like that this is a thing that might actually happen with the craziness going on with this movie, but there's also reasons to assume they'll stick with their plan up to now and just wait for the fall. What do you make of this Paramount Plus Brazil accidental post or whatever?
Yeah. Oh no. It definitely, feels like it's out of the blue, with sort of the near, non-existent sort of marketing for the movie, even for it being on streaming, which, generally does have reduced marketing compared to it being in theaters, of course, which is unfortunate. But, there still would be something for it online, at the very least, even if it is just going directly to streaming. So it does feel very sort of odd that it would be sort of, shadow dropped on Paramount Plus, on the date of the convention, not even sort of like, a lead-in of a day or two to make sure that it's out there for the whole weekend. But again, with it being sort of like now a streaming movie, do they need to sort of like, early Thursday, full day Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the sort of normal process they do for movies in order to get sort of the weekend box office numbers and stuff like that. So, maybe that's not as much of a factor there, but still the short lead-in time, definitely seems, very odd to me. And I don't know, I wonder if that sort of, post of it being the movie was maybe sort of mistaken. Maybe it's something else that's going to be released for the movie on the 25th, which would make more sense coinciding with the SDCC. So that would make, a little bit more sense to me personally. But yeah, it's definitely, not something that we expected to see. And I don't know, it definitely has, like you're saying, a lot of people talking about what it could actually sort of mean.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's pros and cons to this. Like the pro is sort of that, like, because it's a streaming movie, maybe just doing it all at once might just work. You get this mega marketing day where you've had potentially multiple panels, big SDCC showing, you have your big Avatar Aang movie panel, actors there, and you're able to have that big announcement that can be all over social media that like the movie's available like now or in a few hours or something like that. That will get people sort of scrambling, that will generate headlines and a lot of interest and numbers, because people will want to watch the movie officially and start talking about it. It's just that, yeah, this movie has basically zero official marketing. Like, you can go on the Paramount stuff and find the logo for the movie and the like 2-sentence description for the movie, but like there's no proper image out there unless you're basically finding something that was like the t-shirt, which was a mistake with the old title for the movie and all this sort of stuff. So it kind of just feels like, yeah, what is the kind of strategy here? Would it be good to do that, or should they at this point just kind of wait for fall? Because the other thing is that if they do it early, they're kind of abandoning all like the books and potential merchandise stuff. And then they also did announce properly announce the Ang movie Sonic Racing Crossworlds DLC, which is scheduled for October. And I'm sure Sega wouldn't be super happy that, like, wait, we don't get the hype of like it being out right next to the release. It's like months later. Given that they had to probably delay their DLC because the movie was delayed already, and now they get another kind of negative happening to them. So I think there's reasons to kind of go either way. My preference is that, like, I hope we get a little bit of a kind of lead in that, like, it's not just, wait, we can't cover the panel, we've just got to cover the movie. Like, I don't want it to be super rushed where like there's not even a day between like the trailer and then we actually have to do review stuff now. So they can make this work. Like, there's always the situation where they could do it where like maybe the panel's on Friday and it's announced that the movie's out tomorrow. That at least sort of helps, because it feels like you're kind of doing a weird thing to the people in the panel room where it's like, you can watch the movie now, so abandon everything you're doing at the convention to go back to your hotel room and watch the movie. That's a bit of a weird one here. So what are your thoughts on like some of those kind of like logistics surrounding doing a like it's out right now style drop?
Yeah, when you break it down like that with like sort of everything else that's part of the movie, even for a streaming movie, like it feels very sort of unlikely that they would do it in sort of a shadow jump sort of function there, because there's so many moving pieces. Like, I know, streaming reduces a lot of the sort of like overhead of the marketing machine, which is, a big portion of movies productions, even if you don't realize that, and the box office numbers don't sort of reflect that in terms of what it took to make the movie. That is a huge part. So for them to abandon, all of those sort of existing sort of contracts and agreements and stuff like that doesn't feel like something a corporate company would do. And Paramount Skydance is a very corporate company, so they're those things are sort of in place, set in stone as much as they can be with any sort of thing. So yeah, like unless they were doing something where they were actually showing a screening of the movie in at the convention, it would feel very unlikely that they would do it like the next day or the same day or something like that. Like, that feels very sort of odd to me, which is why, personally, I would lean more towards like a trailer or some other sort of like snippet, or, like the first 15 minutes or something like that they would do sort of the movie at the convention, compared to sort of, saying that the movie's just already out and you can just go view it. So I don't know. It feels very odd to me that it would be sort of mass dropped in one sort of big swoop here, but I don't know, considering we don't know as much information about the panel yet, really. And even then, a lot of times they don't really say what's going to happen in the panel directly anyway, so you sort of have to like guess at what the panel's actually going to be about. So I don't know, there's a lot of moving pieces there, and it seems odd that they would just do it in sort of a quick way after all this time and sort of waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird as well, because it's it's a Saturday release, if that's the case. And like, does any streaming platform really put stuff out on a Saturday? Like, there's probably some examples somewhere, but it's not the usual thing. So the idea almost that they do like a very special individual day release for the Ang movie after like doing nothing is a bit like interesting and odd. But yeah, that is the other point. The schedule for Avatar at Comic-Con has not been revealed yet. So Brian seems to confirm that there is stuff at SDCC, but we don't know what days it's happening on. We would expect the usual, so like a big panel, which should be like the Avatar Studios panel or Ang movie panel this year. We'll still probably get a publishing panel and a merchandise panel, but the dates of those we don't really know. I'm going to guess the big panel is probably going to be Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. I'd be really surprised if it's Sunday. Especially with this date in mind, that would be like the day after the movie's out, which is a bit interesting. And then there's also like with the weirdness surrounding some of the stuff, like say like a lot of the books that they probably would be announcing here technically would be the like covers, I guess, for like the Ang movie stuff. But if they've not even put out an image for the movie, we're not going to get those covers. So we kind of need them to talk about the movie first to like open the door for like everything else. So I'd almost kind of feel like they should probably go early in the convention with the big panel, just so like it's out there kind of as soon as possible. And then the other point, like you said, is like, are they actually going to kind of pre-promote the panel as being like a big thing? Like, be there, you will want to be here because we're doing all this stuff. Are the social medias going to like make it clear that you've waited all this time, you're finally going to learn about the Ang movie at this panel? Because it feels like you do have to direct people's eyes towards like this time, this date. And you also have to make it clear that you'll get the information from us because they don't stream SDCC panels, really. They'll show clips, I guess, but like they kind of need to also just showcase that the official Avatar social media accounts are the place to go to for that information. So that's the other point, is like, are we literally going to be like waiting for the panel with still no news, or will we have stuff going in? I kind of feel like there almost has to be some basic marketing where like some of that social media stuff is updated a little bit beforehand. But I suppose the question is like, how much of a like everything is happening all at once is this panel going to be? Will we know anything in the kind of weeks leading into the panel, or is it just going to be it's all on the panel?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like, even for panels that aren't sort of, we'll say, spectacular in terms of like the news that we get out from them, they always do a little bit of, of an info drop on what the panel's actually going to be about. And if this panel is what we hope it's about, the movie and, sort of pushing that sort of whole idea forward, I would suspect there would be, a little bit more in that sort of regard, which would get people more interested in. Because, as we've mentioned before in years gone by, the interest for the, STCC panels for Avatar has, sort of waned over time because there's not as much content to talk about. Like, sure, they always have sort of the publishing stuff, and they always have sort of, the merch stuff as well. But that can only go sort of so far. So if this is about sort of, the official sort of content, it would sort of, behoove them to sort of, make as much noise as they can about it to actually get people sort of, excited and interested in it. Because, people will still go into it. It's still, a popular enough franchise that sort of the concentration of people at a comic book convention will fill out, will have people interested in enough. But yeah, I think it really depends on sort of like, what day do we see the panel at this? Like we've said before, that'll probably be our first key into sort of like how big the panel is, how much of a emphasis do they have at San Diego Comic-Con to warrant, sort of the bigger rooms and stuff like that. Because that, is usually a very good sort of indicator, especially at NYCC, the one that I go to every year. Like, if it's something that's on Sunday, there's not going to be anything, groundbreaking interesting. But if it's on sort of like a Saturday, which is the most popular day for a convention typically, then you can be assured that there's usually something worth it for them to actually be put in that sort of position. And then, of course, if it's late at night, then that usually means that it's a screening of some kind, typically, at least if it's a feature-length film, because that's just sort of when they have the amount of time to do things. I'm still hesitant on the idea of it being sort of a feature release at sort of the panel screening for something like that. It feels like it doesn't feel like usually the bigger corporate companies will do that for their films, even for the animated films. That's usually sort of like a mid-tier company type of thing to sort of do with that. Or, if the movie's already been out in sort of like another language, then they'll do sort of like the English release at the theater or at the convention or something like that. I've been to ones like that. So, I don't know. Those are sort of what I would think in terms of what they could do going forward with it going, with the production of it.
Yeah, so a lot of this is going to depend on sort of like the wording of like, what the panel is called. If it's the Avatar Studios panel, even if it's very vague in the description, then we know like, oh, that's interesting. They've never called the big panel the Avatar Studios panel. It's always been the Braving the Elements podcast panel. Last year it was the ATLA 20th anniversary panel. So if they are clear about like naming it something that is unusual, that will draw attention. And then if it says anything of anything interesting, that's also going to be a big thing. The other, I think, big question is obviously going to be like how much do they focus on the movie like only versus the idea that like, oh, also Seven Havens. And the whole idea of when they have talked about Avatar Studios for all these years has always been we're working on multiple projects. When it starts after all these years, there will be a lot of stuff. So that gives you the impression they probably will talk about Seven Havens. And technically, we have more official information, quote unquote, on Seven Havens than the movie, which is kind of weird. So it kind of feels like they'll want to do that. It does sort of feel like behind the scenes, the focus has shifted to series, and Seven Havens is the first series. So how big do they go there? And then this gets into the idea of, will it just be one big panel, or will there be multiple kind of notable Avatar panels? Because I assume you're probably going to want to have some of the cast, and especially like say Lauren Montgomery, the director of the Aang movie, at the panel. So would Seven Havens stuff kind of get in the way of that? I'm not really sure. So yeah, what are your thoughts there? How much Seven Havens do we get? And then, how big are they going with the Aang movie stuff? Will we see cast, crew fully on stage here for the panel?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The creators as well, studio leads, I guess you would call them now. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel with, like you're saying, they're sort of switch to focus on sort of the shows, the sort of episodic elements, which is what sort of Avatar has always been known for. That they would sort of like split their time towards the panel, and I wouldn't really expect a lot of the cast, unless it's like a full-blown sort of movie panel, to really sort of be there. Like, no, I would expect sort of the creators, some producers and directors and stuff like that. But I wouldn't expect sort of, full sort of shebang there, because that would, it wouldn't really be as much time to sort of cover everything in much sort of detail as they really sort of want to, or at least what they have done in the past there. And, especially if they mention any of the other sort of, productions, such as like the video game, the fighter game, that all eats into the time, as well as sort of any of the, sort of publishing news as well. Because it would feel that, like, since a lot of publishing stuff is sort of tied in with the movie, that they would want to mention that as well, just to get more eyes and, people knowing about that sort of stuff as well. So I don't know. I would think it would be more general, depending on sort of what they actually release. Like, if it's a trailer, then I would expect it to be more multifaceted in terms of what they actually talk about. But if it is just sort of on the movie, then yeah, I don't know. I would lean more towards it being, multiple things rather than just one sort of big thing. Like, I don't know. I would guess maybe there's two panels this year, one that focus on more sort of the mainstream content, and then one that focus on sort of like the secondary content and tertiary stuff like that, sort of like the merchandises and stuff like that, that doesn't get mentioned at the main panel because maybe it's not directly related to the Aang movie or Seven Havens.
Mm-hmm. It does leave the kind of cast and crew in an interesting situation where, like, if the movie does release July 25th, like, they'll have had no, like zero appearances with fans, like, no interaction with fans. Like, they've never been highlighted as the cast of the movie, basically. They got their cast and crew screening, but that was it. So it's an interesting one with this, where, like, they have a little bit more, I guess, of a celebrity cast this time out. Like, are we just not going to see or use them? Look, I'm guessing we'll get interviews with them on, like, the podcast whenever it comes back, which is, I guess, maybe an announcement that also might happen at Comic-Con, is, like, coming back for their kind of Korra season, and I guess support interviews related to the Aang movie, hopefully. And that's just a kind of weird thing for me, the idea of, like, oh, like, are we just, like, never going to get, like, an interview with any of these actors? Is kind of like an interesting point. If they do keep the fall date, like, it means that then, like, New York Comic Con is either post release or, like, a week or two before the release of the movie. They might do something more kind of like there. But yeah, it puts them in an interesting spot here, where, like, there's a lot riding on Comic-Con for, like, it feels like the fate of the franchise, basically, where, like, if they don't come out of this and, like, have most fans, I think, kind of, like, pleased with what they showed, that's kind of a little bit of a bad look. So that's why I kind of feel like, yeah, in my mind, yeah, they kind of need to come out of this with, at the very least, all the big outlets being able to go like they showed off the Aang movie properly for the first time, plus they showed some really interesting information on Seven Havens. That like, especially if they do have like maybe like full trailer for the Aang movie, teaser trailer for Seven Havens, that would be, I think, huge to just be able to be like, hey, one panel, we showed off two projects for like the first time properly. That's like really big. That's kind of what I think we've always wanted, is just a mass amount of information. But we'll see how they do it. I'm guessing we should know the Comic-Con schedule by like this time next week. Comic-Con, they usually wait until like 2 weeks beforehand. New York Comic-Con, the panels are usually out like a month beforehand, but SDCC is a bit later. But so I think by about next week we'll know what's happening here. So we won't have too long to kind of go crazy speculating on things. We should have our 2-3 panels, plus I wouldn't be surprised if there's actually quite a lot of other stuff, like more official signings and stuff like that this time out as well. And then show floor will be interesting because they went kind of big last year, whereas you'd expect them to go big this year. And then again, I think I've said this a few times now, like surely the show floor is like movie. So that's why partially you can't just reveal everything about the movie at the panel, because you have to have some of that stuff on the show floor. Because one of the details last year was that apparently they were meant to have like a t-shirt booth where you could get Aang movie stuff on t-shirts, and that never actually happened. So I assume they want to do that this year. But any thoughts on show floor stuff? How big will that be this year?
That's a good point. I mean, I don't know if this is really full on for the movie and it would be like an actual release thing, then I would expect more on the show floor. If it's just sort of the trailer for it and the trailer's still, a couple months out, I don't know. I don't think I would expect as much sort of pomp and circumstance on the actual show floor. I would still expect them to have a booth and stuff like that, but I don't think I would expect it to be as big as it was, previously for sort of, the anniversary and stuff like that. Because that was pretty involved. They had it at both conventions, and there was like multiple things you could do it and multiple things you could get out of it as well. Like it was actually hard to get to it because you pretty much had to schedule your time around trying to get through it, for the most part, unless you were there like super early or something like that. Just because, it is popular. That is sort of like, a thing at a convention that would do well. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to figure what they would do sort of for the show floor, because, there's other stuff that, the Paramount Skydance does as well. So all of that sort of feeds into sort of their bigger budget and productions of shows and stuff like that, right? So it's not just, Avatar that they're concerned with. That's what we're focusing on, but, they do have other projects, Team NT and stuff like that they sort of, have their, I guess you could say priority lists of, what's important to them and sort of, they're pushing in their sort of marketing. So, unfortunately, Avatar might get sort of pushed out by sort of the other projects that do sort of, make more notice for them. So I don't know. I would expect it to have some presence, but I don't think I would expect it to have the same level of presence right now as it had, for last year's set of conventions.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's all that stuff, and I think most of the rest of the big news is mostly just fighting game information, because we're now kind of past the initial release date for the game. It's actually coming out on the 23rd. A bunch of stuff has happened. We know year one pass characters. We know the characters that are part of the vote. Pre-orders went up for consoles. Pre-orders went up for physical copies of the game. So realistically, the only stuff they've not talked about yet is the story mode. And even then, some screenshots have come out, at least telling us a little bit about it, but it still remains very vague, the true scope of what the story actually is going to be. And then Zahir, Ozai, Avatar State Aang, Avatar State Korra are the main roster characters they've not fully covered just yet. But they do still have just under 3 weeks left until this all happens. So let's go over the pass stuff. So There's going to be 5 new characters added to the game as part of the year 1 pass. Four of these characters are confirmed. They're going to be there, and then the 5th will be the vote. So the 4 confirmed characters are Iroh, so that's ATLA Iroh, Uncle Iroh, Ty Lee, Lin Beifong, and Bo Lin. So I think most people are pretty happy with this kind of lineup of like, they hit, I think, the really obvious 2 ATLA characters that they just kind of had to have in the game at some point. And then the rest of it is Korra characters, and kind of really cool Korra characters in that, yeah, not a lot of earthbenders on the roster, so let's bring in a kind of earth and metal bender and an earth and lava bender, and we kind of give more Korra Team Avatar characters and Lin as like a fan favorite character. I think they did some pretty interesting stuff here. You could maybe make the case that maybe should Asami be a locked in character versus what we'll get to, but I quite like the 4 choices here. But what are your thoughts on the confirmed year 1 pass characters?
Oh, I agree. I like them. I think these are, characters that are popular enough that people have already sort of been asking for them, which, you can sort of see by sort of the response to them in general here. There's always going to be other characters that people sort of have an idea could work well, but that's the cool thing about Avatar in general is just that there are so many sort of characters here. So, but no, I'm happy with these.
And then they have revealed the 5 characters part of the vote. You have to pre-order the game to get a vote. They've not, I think, explained the full mechanism by which the vote will happen. They've said, I think, it will happen after the game launches. So, I don't know. Is there some way for them to like surface a vote in the game for people who've pre-ordered? I don't actually know. Or will they do it via email? I don't really know. Either way, the options that they're giving us to vote on are Tenzin, Kuvira, Amon, King Boomy, and Asami. So it's 4 Korra characters, only 1 ATLA character. And it's really interesting because I think this is a very competitive pool of characters here where like the ATLA character is very interesting, but like you don't immediately assume they'll win the character vote just because it's an ATLA character. And then they've chosen some of the best Korra characters that are kind of left over. So it will be super interesting to see what way it actually ends up going, because again, the vote is going to be split between basically, I guess, like a lot of Avatar Korra fans, but then also like the fighting game community, where they'll be voting almost entirely on the basis of like who would make the best like in-game character based on like mechanics. So it's an interesting one in terms of a breakdown perspective, in that like if say Boomy or Kuvira wins, the pass technically has like 3 Earthbender characters, and if Kuvira wins, that would be 3 Korra era Earthbender characters added to the game, which is a little bit kind of interesting. There aren't that many Airbender characters, so like Tenzin is an interesting option. Amon, of course, will be quite unique because he's obviously going to be blood bending and chi blocking, not really normal water bending, so that's sort of unique for him. And then Asami, of course, one of the main Korra characters, but also a unique non-bender with kind of technology stuff. And then King Boomy's just super unique. So what are your thoughts on the 5 character options?
This is a hard one to sort of think who would actually sort of win in this, because I don't know. I think it's good, even though it might have been cool for them to have like one more ATLA, from the original series character here. I think, there's enough variation in here that people have to sort of think about, who's their actual sort of favorite here. But I think, at least in terms of them having sort of like you're saying, sort of like, generally, unique abilities, except for, I guess, maybe not Tenzin, but, he's still a master airbender, so I'm sure they can tweak him to make him, different than Aang, or, of course, he'll be different than Zahir. So, he might be the only one that's, I guess you could say maybe a bit more sort of boring compared to the other ones. But, all the other ones are pretty sort of cool there, the 4 to the right there. So, I don't know. I think... I'm also very curious to see who could be, because I think in terms of like the original series, if a lot of people who are just sort of hardcore into sort of the original series and sort of that has, a very sort of vocal voice in the fandom, then, it would be sort of like a landslide for Boomy in that regard. But I don't, as much as Boomy's a cool character, I'm not sure if him by himself has that much sort of interest on his own. I don't know. Maybe he does that. He'll be sort of like a sweep for the votes. I hope they give like a breakdown of what the actual votes for this actually was when they do this. Not just sort of black box it, but regardless, I think it'll be really cool to see all these characters because I think they'll definitely, I don't know, they'll add a lot of uniqueness towards sort of balancing sort of the game and sort of what they actually do. Like, just with Amon and his sort of abilities to be able to sort of like control another character and how they'll sort of figure out how to limit that, or even Kavir with, metal bending and how she does that with other people. I think that'll, bring a lot of uniqueness to it. So yeah, no, I'm happy with it. I don't really know who's going to win, or if, anything like that.
Yeah, like I'd say from a just character, not thinking about gameplay perspective, I think Asami probably has like the most maybe like overall like support because I think just like all Korra fans, I think just want to make sure Asami is for sure in the game. But I think Amon potentially stands out to me as like the kind of front runner here, just because, cool character, villain from the first season of Korra, which I think a lot of people have seen. The bloodbending stuff will be interesting to see how they do it. So he has that mix of like he should be cool from a gameplay and also a character perspective. But I think Boomy has a chance. A lot of this, I suppose, also depends on like the way they were talking about it on the stream when they announced this was like they've done work on all of these characters already to at least plan out how they would go. So this vote is, I guess, mostly just who comes to the game first. Obviously, because a year 2 DLC kind of is not like confirmed yet, but the game looks like it's going to do well enough to probably get some more characters down the line, and it kind of feels like, well, the losers from the vote are going to be like really obvious to kind of come up next, with maybe the only worry being just like whoever comes last, maybe they might not prioritize, but we don't know how that all is going to work. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I think all the characters seem to have a little bit of support, but yeah, like you said, Tenzin perhaps maybe not the most focused on character, just because I think they need to show, I think, maybe a little bit more of like what will truly make him unique, by actually showing moves and potential things. But everyone else, I think, really does stand out. But otherwise, yeah, the beta is ongoing right now. The difference with the beta compared to the alpha is that Azula and Sokka are now in it. So you don't get to play as Kyoshi, even though Kyoshi kind of has been revealed since. It's all those characters, and that's going to run for the next kind of couple of days. They're saying something else might happen on PlayStation because I think there were massive delays getting it up on PlayStation, so I guess it might be extended there. But yeah, otherwise we are for the most part just waiting for this game to now release. And again, this game is going to release the first day of San Diego Comic-Con, the 23rd. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And yeah, I think it's mostly just story mode stuff. One of the screenshots tells us a few things. Is that it's a line of dialogue from Katara. It confirms that they are doing the multi-era crossover thing, because she says places and people from different eras, and they also say it happens in like a harmonic rift, which if you read the story spoilers from like a year ago for the game, that was the main kind of like gimmick for how this all happens, is through harmonic rifts, which are basically rifts of space-time to make this facilitate this unique plot. So some aspect of like the core idea of the game is here. It's just we don't know the full scope of the story in terms of like the crazy ambition of what that was, where like it involved like 30 characters, and it felt like they were writing the most amazing Avengers movie basically ever, the way they were going with it. I get the impression Avatar Studios have already asked them to kind of calm down a little bit with that, but who is the villain? What's happening with these harmonic rifts? Is it just to facilitate the characters crossing over? Or is there some bigger surprise that we don't actually know about? Because, if you just go off the base roster of the game, there's not a lot of characters from other eras, because it's like it's Korra, Zahir, and Kyoshi. And if the Kyoshi era is one of the things, well, apart from Kyoshi's supports, we don't really have any other characters from that era, so what's going on? But what are your expectations for the story? And I suppose the idea that weeks from release, they've not actually truly spoken about it.
Yeah, I don't know. This is one of those things where I'm really sort of wondering, the focus of, sort of the game in general. And, it is a fighter game, so it is primarily sort of a versus thing and sort of getting multiplayer to work and sort of getting the net code and all that stuff so it can be used online, which I know was part of the issues with PlayStation, stuff like that. So I don't know. I think, after sort of the very sort of large ambition that they had for the game originally before it sort of was, put in limbo and then sort of resurrected. I don't know. I just feel like the scale of the story is very sort of minor in sort of the grand scheme of things because, the most we've gotten is these, two screenshots essentially that have dialogue from the story. So we know it's there. I don't know. It feels like that's not enough of a focus for them to sort of talk about it already, unless they're really trying to, keep it to the vest and like, it's going to be something really sort of special. But I don't know. It feels like if it really was something special, they would sort of say something about it, at this point in time. And, it's only like a couple weeks now until it actually comes out, right? So I don't know, unless we get sort of like another trailer that shows a little bit more of the story, I don't know. I'm not sort of, have high hopes for seeing a lot of it until, the game is pretty much sort of out there. So yeah, I don't know. I'm really curious to see how they take the story, but I guess, that really isn't sort of like, it doesn't feel like that's a focus of this particular fighter game, which I know in other fighting games, that is a pretty strong focus, and those stories in those games are actually really good. So yeah, I don't know.
It's an interesting one just because, like, I think they've done a really good kind of marketing campaign to appeal to fighting game players, but like, say, beginner fighting game players who are Avatar fans, that's maybe the question you kind of might have about this, and that like this would be one of the really appealing moments, and that I think a lot of people are intimidated about playing a fighting game online, so the story mode would be the place that people kind of play a lot of, the arcade mode. I'm interested to see what they do with it, because there's still weirdness about like some of the stuff that they've put out there says the game's story is canon, but very clearly era crossover stuff leans super heavily non-canon. I think it's just them in a weird marketing way trying to say like the story is official. They worked with Avatar Studios, they worked with Mike, they worked with Tim Hedrick to write this story. But like, is it canon that like Katara met Kyoshi and literally had multiple conversations with her? No, I don't think so. But they're trying to go for more so the idea that like, if they did meet, this would be the style of dialogue that they have. And here's just a crazy story that's kind of interesting within the context of this. I don't think we're going to actually have any real canonical takeaways from this necessarily. And I think that's fine. I think the story will be better if they just kind of lean into their kind of era crossover thing, the dialogue between the characters, and I don't know, if they have even like 2-3 cutscenes that get across some sense of a kind of interesting story with, I don't know, like a spirit opening up these kind of space-time rifts of like, here's this crazy non-canon spirit who can shape time and space that can be defeated by like multiple avatars in the avatar state. That's probably the best way to kind of go with it there. If that spirit design or whatever is interesting, then I think you've done something, I think, reasonably well. So yeah, I'm interested to see all that stuff. We're only, like I said, weeks away from the release. And stuff is kind of finally beginning to happen there. Like, it is cool that we're going to have a kind of hyped Avatar game releasing right as Comic-Con hits, right as hopefully we'll get a lot of news. So it's cool that we're only weeks away from finally getting information. Because, we have this other stuff like, hey, it was kind of cool to experience the release of Netflix Avatar over the last kind of week or two for season 2. But the interest has kind of dwindled here. So we'll switch over to our kind of review kind of stuff here. And kind of, I suppose we'll use the news about that as a bit of a transition. That yeah, the viewing numbers are down. I think it's 59% from the first 4 days comparing season 1 and season 2. The numbers are kind of way down. I noticed this on my YouTube videos as well, covering it. It was much bigger during season 1 compared to season 2, even though it still felt like there was a reasonable amount of hype from some of the marketing, but the result of that is that, like, yeah, the interest is a little bit lower. What do you put that down to? Why do you think, after everything seemed to be going well with, like, confirmed for season 2 and 3, the production seemed to go well, why has it dropped so drastically in your mind?
Yeah. No, I mean, there is, a period of time. So, a lot of people have factored that into the production. Some people are factoring in just sort of, what they consider sort of the brevity of the actual season and how it plays out overall. Some people just consider just sort of the state of the franchise overall now has just sort of been wax and wane, especially with the league and being in the news for things that aren't generally positive. That all sort of like factors into it in some regard. Some people are just sort of unhappy with, the way the story has been progressing and everything like that, which, considering that it did seem like, they were sort of, as much as, any sort of, entity of creative people can be sort of, receptive towards, some of the feedback that people had from, season 1 and stuff like that. There's that to sort of factor into it, as well as, were we heard in that regard there. Some parts is just sort of, sort of the direction of the casting and stuff like that. I mean, there's so many facets that sort of could be played into it, but I definitely have, seen and noticed sort of, just a lot more, I guess you could say, just negativity towards sort of the show and the series overall, which, unfortunately, we have a comparison to other, live action Netflix shows, which is sort of the point that a lot of the articles are sort of making there in terms of the drop in popularity there. I mean, I have seen that it is on, Netflix's, top whatever list on their actual site itself, but, considering we don't, completely sort of understand how those numbers work and how that factors into things, that can be sort of like nebulous in terms of, going by that as sort of a metric in that regard there. But I think, from watching this show and this season, this one, I can see where, a lot of the points and the criticism are sort of coming from. So I think, there is a lot towards sort of it just sort of not, potentially living up towards the hype that a lot of people had for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just looked up was there a similar drop for One Piece live action? And it seems like it went from 18.5 to 16.8. So it was a much, much smaller drop there, which is probably to be expected for like any second season of a thing. So Avatar dropping so clearly is kind of big. My own thoughts are that, like, I'd probably sum it up as one, I think people are frustrated these days with the whole, here's season 1, let's wait to get confirmation before we do anything else, and so you're waiting 2.5 years for the next kind of drop of content. I think that's a factor. And then also, I think with live action Avatar in particular, I think they had a real, like, people had a kind of, I think, big realization once they actually saw the show, because I think the marketing for season 1 was going really, really well right up until, like, literally people saw the episodes, and then there was a bit of a, oh, actually this isn't as good as I thought it was going to be from the trailers. And I think just a lot of people haven't come back for season 2 now that they've seen kind of what it actually is, because the impression you get from those number drops is that, like, a lot of people tried the show out initially, and a lot of people are trying it out again for season 2, which is also, I think, part of the reporting on this, is that the numbers have spiked a little bit again for season 1, but I get the impression that kind of drop off is probably still there as well. So those two things are probably like my main kind of thoughts on it. It's still kind of like big numbers-ish, for an Avatar thing, so that'll be sort of helpful, I guess, for the fandom, especially now that some of the stuff we've actually been waiting for is beginning to happen. But let's get into season 2 here. So we're going to review the first 2 episodes here overall. So I guess we'll jump straight in with the first episode. So for me, this was the one I was probably, in a way, the most worried about going into the season. Interestingly, after having seen the full season, weirdly, maybe the end of season stuff is actually more of the problem than the early season stuff, even though the earlier episodes maybe showcase some of the changes a bit more obviously. I mostly find this first episode to be, I think, pretty fine, and I only really have like issues with maybe like one or two like little things. Like I can accept a lot of swapping and changing for the adaptation, and I think they do an okay job of kind of dealing with a time skip enforced by kind of production stuff on the show and combining episodes in a sort of interesting way. So I think the start here is actually like pretty decent, at least for me. But what are your general thoughts on the first episode, Somewhere Safe?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a weird one. I mean, I think I can see sort of the changes they go from, and I try to like not behold them towards sort of like the original show and stuff like that, because it is an adaptation. It is sort of their way of interpreting the story, and I think the little sort of like little bits they add in there for like sort of the extended period of time and sort of the changing of sort of Aang specifically. I think some of that sort of works for me in the first episode. But there's also some areas where I could begin to see where people are having issues with how they're dealing with sort of like Azula and sort of even Zuko to some regard. Even though I think for the most part I liked him during most of this season. But I think it's also just in general this is sort of like setting the tone, which I thought I don't know, I thought in season one it did a pretty good idea of sort of making us aware of what this actually is compared to sort of the original one, or just trying to make it sort of stand on its own. But I think this season, and looking in the first episode, does even more of a job of sort of showing those differences, and I think that could start to begin to sort of alienate some people from sort of really enjoying it as much as they might have, considering, what's going to come later on in the season and stuff like that. So it's an odd one. I think it's okay. But I think, there's also a lot of little things that they're adding into it, which I think by the end of the season, like what you're saying there, maybe feels like a little bit too much, considering what they have the chance to actually show.
Yeah, like it's so complicated because I think like in a vacuum, you can follow the writers, I guess, with most of the changes that they make, that like, oh, this being in this place actually makes sense because of this. But when you get to the later episodes and the context of this, the normal context of this episode is missing, some of those big kind of canon pillar moments that they're never going to change do sort of suffer from the fact that like you have just done something completely different and you've not like adjusted that moment for all the other stuff that you've adjusted. And then some of these addition moments like don't kind of follow through because you mostly feel some of the cuts, and it's messy because I think very little of the show I maintain from season one is like bad. Like I don't think there's going to be like that many moments where we're just like, what were they thinking with this moment? It's just mostly like, this is fine, I have some questions, I'm not sure about this, but it's okay. And that's kind of where this show is kind of most of the time for me, is that like it's not very like, I suppose, spiky. There's not many like disastrously bad moments, but there's also not that many like amazing moments. That's kind of the way I tend to always like sum up this show, is that like it's very watchable, but if you want to, it's also very easy to pick apart. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's funny. I've talked to my friend about this, and yeah, it's like a lot of the little moments, like I don't actually mind them. Like some of the changes, like when I can clearly see the changes of what they're doing, to fit this new format, I actually don't mind them. But it's sort of the connecting of them. Sometimes it just doesn't sort of quite work for me personally as well as I sort of thought it would be, and I think show, I think, I don't know, it feels like if the show was more sort of like in a vacuum, which of course it wouldn't be made potentially sort of that way, if it was, but I think if it was sort of made and sort of not as connected to the original source and sort of left out some of the little things which are cool and they were fun in the original show, but they don't sort of quite work as well here because of the length that they have, which is only 7 episodes. It's like, why like, did you really need to include that? Like, could there have been another way that you could have sort of connected the episodes or given characters more sort of key moments that, would have felt more sort of, I guess, impactful for what they're actually doing here? So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely an odd one to sort of see this, and it just doesn't help that we know the sort of source material so well.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of discourse about this of like, should you be overly criticizing or comparing this to the original? But like the point is, like, it's an adaptation.
Yeah.
It's always going to be there. And I think once you don't like it is a change, therefore it is bad. Once you don't do that and can sort of attempt to follow the writers on their journey, it's like okay. And that's kind of like the point here. But like also like some people defending the show are just kind of like, what were you expecting it to be 1-to-1? Like, no, but I have an issue here. Like, that's fine. But let's get into episode 1. So we'll go through this kind of like somewhat kind of quickly, but still trying to touch on a bit of everything. We get our intro here. It is narrated by Katara this time out, whereas I think Kyoshi did it, I think, in season 1. And we get our classic kind of fire, earth, air, water. Fire Nation attacked. The Avatar vanished. They kind of, I think, somewhat cleverly kind of used the Aang overlooking the world thing to introduce us to the present day idea of he's overlooking Omashu, which is what we're kind of jumping into kind of immediately. You see one of the, I suppose, biggest issues from season 1, the fact that we never saw Aang attempt to learn waterbending, and we just highlight off screen he learned waterbending. And Katara says he's pretty good, but the idea is he basically is a master waterbender. They're just going to show this by one correction that Katara does to his form very early on in this episode. So that's the kind of intro that we get here. We're jumping in with a bit of a altered version of Return to Omashu, which also highlights that we're skipping over kind of Avatar state, but we'll do aspects of this later on. And then we obviously did Cave of Two Lovers in a very weird way in season 1. So technically we start where we're kind of meant to here. But what did you think of the intro this time out?
Yeah, I thought the intro was fine. I think, getting that sort of narration, that's on brand for what we know of the show. For Katara to sort of do it, I think it works, and it leads well into sort of our first sort of action set piece here, where we get to see Aang and his sort of abilities and how they've progressed, I guess, over this course of period of time that he's been training, right? I don't know, it's odd that they are sort of, consider him essentially a master, but they do sort of, show that he does still need some sort of practice here. So, I don't know, I guess it sort of works for me in terms of what they're doing here. And, it's sort of like done for laughs, like it's a comedic bit here. So I can see sort of why they're trying to go for it. I think, I don't know, that's interesting to see throughout the season how they try to do the comedy throughout this one compared to sort of the original, in which, is something that people are always sort of going to keep in mind here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our first opening sequence is we kind of get reintroduced to like a lot of the Omashu related characters, including the Earth Kingdom soldier that Iroh interacted with in season 1. We get a new character here, Amita, who is kind of interesting in the way they do her. Like, she's kind of like completely an original character in terms of what they do here. We basically just highlight that the refugees on the run are losing hope. They don't think anyone is going to arrive, which is exactly when Team Avatar and also the Kyoshi warriors arrive. Yes, we get Aang arrives in, tries to do waterbending, needs some form correction, and like I said, this is the only time in the whole season there's any sort of like, you are not a master waterbender going on here. So yeah, he eventually sends the guy flying. We immediately jump in with just how amazingly skilled Katara is after the time skip as well. We get some cool kind of CG shots with her bending. Sokka and Suki reunite, and we immediately get into what ends up becoming like one of Sokka's only real plot threads like this entire season. We really linger on this quite a bit. The idea is that he is not as into the reunion with Suki because he can't get over his feelings and kind of thoughts about what happened with Yue. So this is the whole Serpent's Pass thing, which is ultimately the core of what this episode is adapting. So it's kind of correct here, but we're greatly extending this to the point where it's still open going into season 3, which is kind of interesting. in terms of like Sokka and Suki directly talking about this. I think there's some kind of fun stuff here where you can see there's an immediate attempt to sort of make the dynamic, the kind of banter between the Team Avatar members a lot better, where it was a little bit kind of stiff, I guess, in season 1. So there's moments of kind of improvement, I think, that you can see here kind of straight away, that like they benefit from actually having sets and not just everything's on the volume. But what are your thoughts on some of these early kind of Team Avatar scenes?
I like their interactions overall here. It does, it does make them feel like a team, like Katara and Aang sort of working together. Like this definitely feels like they're sort of in sync with what they're doing here. And, even Sokka gets a couple highlight moments here, especially right before he meets sort of Suki here. So I think, compared to what we've seen before, it does feel like, after the time break here that they have sort of, worked on the sort of their team unity, their team sort of bonding here as the three of them. I do sort of appreciate that, because it does feel like that was something that was sort of mentioned before, which I guess sort of like, in the initial stages of a relationship, with a group of friends, you wouldn't be sort of like as in tune, but after these years, or whatever the time period is, they would be more in sync.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are vague about the time skip. Toph says a line later on that alludes to it being like 2 years at least, because she says it took him years to learn waterbending. But again, they're not super specific on it, but it seems to be about that, because that would match the like IRL kind of timeline stuff that they do. One interesting thing they do here is Katara goes to heal the Earth Kingdom soldier and asks Aang to help her, and so it's only in this episode. I don't believe the healing is ever addressed in any other episode when it comes to Aang. Aang does learn healing in this version of the show, and it's literally only these 2 scenes. There is a sense that Aang is quite hesitant about doing it, which is kind of weird. So it feels like it's a season 3 setup for like Aang, I guess, is going to have to heal someone. So we'll see whatever they kind of plan to do with that. What did you make of this, Aang learning healing?
Oh, the idea of him learning healing, I was fine with. Like, for whatever, reasons or whatever, that wasn't a thing in the original one. But I think, him learning it, it kind of seems like right. Like, I'm sure there's, some, idea of like, having the skill and the ability and the aptitude and sort of the willingness that factors into sort of, any waterbender sort of learning this sort of technique. That's okay. That's cool. I do wonder, like you're saying, if it is going to come into play, like, when he learns firebending, is he going to have to heal someone because he does it? Are they going to sort of flip it on his head in terms of that regard? That might be a cool change to sort of see if that's what they go with. It is sort of odd in this episode overall how it is such a sticking point for him and sort of like a hesitation type of thing. I don't know. That sort of felt, a bit sort of odd to me, considering, you would think that him as a general pacifist, as being an airbender, that might be something that he might, more so be into. So, there are aspects of it that did feel a bit sort of out of place to me, in terms of what we know. Now, again, maybe this is something that would lead into sort of the break in time and some other stuff happen, but as far as what I can understand from on screen, that was sort of an odd one, especially since it's brought up, only in this part of the show so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just like, who is he going to heal? Because like, will they just do like Aang burns Katara while during firebending training? Yeah. But she has healing herself, and the whole point of that initial scene is that she can do it to herself. So it feels like it has to be someone else, and it's like, are we setting up like that, like some weird thing where like, because they basically, in my mind, kind of did the dynamics of the Ozai fight from the animation here for Azula at the end, are they going to have Aang like injure Ozai and heal him or something like that? Which I don't know. It's pure speculation, obviously, at this point, but it's so weird that there are only like 2 Aang healing scenes in the whole thing. There's some fun stuff here. Like we do get moments like, say, Aang and Suki interacting, because this show has the benefit of hindsight and knowing that Suki's a very popular character, so they can use her more than the original did, where she was a character who kind of had to come into prominence from them adapting to the popularity of the character. Either way, the point here is that Aang learns that Bumi's being held captive in Omashu, so he immediately kind of heads in there to do it. So we skip the whole idea of needing to do any massive plot about like infiltrating the city, getting people out. The people are already out, and Aang can just get in there by flying. So we get to basically, return to Omashu. We are just doing the one scene that's kind of super important to the plot here. He speaks to Bumi because he needs an earthbending master, but of course it's not going to be Bumi. We go through the kind of classic stuff here. There's some slight extra seriousness in this version of the show because this version of Bumi is a lot more serious. But he's more like his original version here because he has the arc from season 1. So yeah, he still talks about the challenge. It was the toughest thing he ever had to do, was to do nothing to save his people. This line will come up later on. He had to feel everything to feel nothing, which is the key to feeling everything, which will go on to be the thing that makes Aang actually learn seismic sense, which is presented as a very important plot point in this show, as we'll learn as the episodes go on. There's also a really interesting line of dialogue that I might be giving them a little bit too much credit on. Bumi talks about like, oh, time is catching up with you. Also, like, the stars are catching up with you. And it's like, is this some vague reference to the comet/eclipse? Given that we're talking about, like, why did you decide to wait for a specific moment, Bumi? What are you waiting for? And I feel it's just meant to be something resembling that, given that I guess he's waiting for the eclipse. They go into Jings. They focus on this a bit here. He needs a teacher who is a neutral Jing master, and who knows, it might actually be a friend, but for now they will see each other another time. Again, this is one of those scenes where, again, as an individual scene, it's, I think, pretty nicely done, slightly extended from the original, misses some of the context from surrounding scenes from Return to Omashu, but it's very functional in terms of what it kind of gets across and is pretty nicely done. What are your thoughts on the Bumi scene?
Yeah, no, I think this scene works well in the context of what we know about Bumi from the live action series here, right? Because it definitely, like you said there, it definitely does have a bit of a more serious tone for it, but I think, the show overall is just more sort of serious because that's how they're sort of interpreting it into the live action format here, which, for the most part, I think makes sense for the way that they're going about it. But yeah, no, this feels pretty much sort of on par. I mean, it would have been fun to have sort of like him going through the city and sort of having the battle with Azula early, but that's, it's sort of reformatted differently here that we don't really sort of need that. And Azula's already come and gone from the city here, so there's no real reason for her to be here in this sort of instance here. So I don't know. I like that Aang's able to get in. He's able to overwhelm the people and sort of talk to Bumi really quickly here. And Bumi's still sort of an oddball character at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Next up is the first Zuko Iroh scene. I find these to be a little bit like they're quite they're doing the arc from early book 2 for Zuko, and they have to do it very quickly. This has to be an accelerated version of this because we will get to basically Zuko alone right at the end of this episode. The setup for that is right here. So this has to go from end of book 1 straight into Zuko on his own, abandoning Iroh basically over the course of like these couple of scenes. So it all has to be quite quick, blunt, each scene just doing really clear-cut things. Whereas, of course, the benefit of the original is that it has time in each of these episodes. The Zuko plot is typically the kind of side plot of each of these early episodes, and it gradually builds to Zuko alone, gradually builds to like the return to of Iroh, whereas they have to kind of compress it together like a little bit more. Like this initial scene, is you see how restless Zuko is, kind of just doing kind of like fruit and vegetable picking here. He struggles to accept that they're fugitives on the run. But yeah, what are your thoughts on how they do this Zuko arc here in this first episode?
Oh, it's odd because it is just these couple snippets, maybe like 4 or 5 of them, and then you have this sort of big upset at the end of everything. And I don't know. I think in one way, sort of, it comes across pretty clearly that he's just sort of upset with his station in life, which is, pretty much where on par with the original one, right? Like it makes sense. He's he's come from the top and now he's even more so at sort of the bottom and isn't even working towards the goal that he, had for himself overall. Whereas Iroh's just sort of content to sort of be where he's at in life here. So, I think, they get across the frustration pretty well here. And you get to sort of see sort of his, just sort of, I don't know, just sort of upset with the whole situation and the status of thing and sort of, wanting to sort of stand up for himself, especially when he has to interact with other people directly, sort of at the same issue here. Definitely, you can see where his issue lies with things. So I guess they did a good job in that regard.
We cut over to Zula, and also Ozai is involved here as well. He's informed about a bunch of recent losses, despite the big success at Bossing Say. Lo and Lee, I think, get their first live action scene in the background, just making some kind of snide comments. There's a few things that happen here. He turns to like, oh, the excellent second born of the royal family. Let's hear what you have to say. And she addresses Iroh's failed siege of Ba Sing Se, but that they have to turn their attention to Ba Sing Se. If they take that out, they'll kind of win the war, that sort of idea. She comes up with this plan that is in essence this show's version of like the drill. Like, we'll use captured earthbenders to tunnel under the wall. And Ozai kind of likes the plan and approves it, but gives this other General Tran, the command of that plan, which really confuses Azula, and she is very taken aback by this. But he says, I have a special mission for you, and that is to bring Zuko home. So again, we continue this trend in the live action show of really showing like Ozai clearly kind of manipulating, messing with Azula, and almost I would say like the odd point of just like, it feels like, why is Azula so confused by this? Like, that she needs like Mei and Ty Lee in these scenes to kind of point out what's happening here. Like, I get the idea, like even from the original, that this is sort of like implied to be sort of the dynamic that like Ozai is like the one person that she doesn't control or kind of attempt to manipulate. She's below him. But this is also kind of like why they never showed this until like basically much later on in the original series. Whereas this is meant to be the part of the story where we're highlighting that like Azula is like the most competent, the most kind of cunning character. It is odd to show these kind of vulnerabilities like so clearly up front. When fundamentally they still get to basically the same points with her. So I think this is just, especially from season 1, some of the stuff that maybe just didn't work as well. Like, a lot of this stuff didn't really feel like it was needed to expand it out. I get it in the sense that like they wanted to, I suppose, have the cast together from a very early point and not just introduce her in season 2. But it's odd to me, some of what they're doing here. But what do you make of this first scene for Azula in the show?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's weird because I mean it's her idea. We're generally led to believe that she's a very sort of competent person. Her plan here, but he's immediately pretty much sort of shooting down her idea. We're not shooting it down, but just sort of saying that it's something that he would do, but only because of at her age here. So it's sort of like a slight on her idea here, just sort of basically sort of keeping her in a place here, which I don't know. I guess overall, throughout this season here, we see sort of, the manipulations that he has, or just sort of, I guess you could say, just the Fire Nation family in general, or at least that's how he's, using it in terms of, using the brother and the sister against each other here towards sort of what he considers the ultimate goal of the Fire Nation, right? And sort of, what we know now is sort of like the history of the Fire Nation in general, at least in terms of, how they sort of, have their heirs and, ruling sort of the Fire Nation going forward here. So I don't know. I think, definitely is something to sort of see her sort of having sort of these issues early on here, which I don't know. I wonder if that's just because of sort of the accelerated way they're doing the show overall, that they sort of have to sort of show her faults earlier so that we can sort of understand when she goes off the deep end later on. But I don't know. I think a lot of this episode, or this season specifically, you can sort of see, cracks in general, or just sort of the difference in her compared to what we've sort of come to expect of her sort of character here, which I don't know if that's necessarily an issue as much, but it's just something to note here that sometimes feels like it works, sometimes it doesn't feel in the context of just the season overall.
After this, the general who was given the plan does basically pledge his like full undying loyalty to her, and that like any victory he has will be hers. And he effectively kind of says that like, you know, I pledge myself to you, like I see you as being the future Fire Lord. That's the implication from this scene, is that like you will be Fire Lord one day. I will be your most loyal general. And she really likes this, so she feels kind of down coming out of this situation, but actually she basically wins because the guy who's in charge is doing everything for her. And she'll use this loyalty to her advantage over the course of this, and it seems like she actually like uses him effectively as a general on her side, which is fine. It's I suppose fitting for this version of the show to do that, because they had the whole her supporting Zhao in the first season, so she needs like another kind of person to manipulate as well. It's solid. I'm guessing the setup here is that she'll banish Tran towards the end of season 3, and it will just emphasize like here's a character that we met who she'll discard, even though he was super useful. But do you have any thoughts on Tran and how he was used?
Yeah, no, that is something to know, because I mean, you like you said, you clearly get the idea that his support is behind her and not necessarily her father as the Fire Lord here, which I think it's something to note that they're sort of getting it in our ideas earlier enough that, she could be the one ruling everything, which I think, with what they do later on with her in sort of, the Earth Kingdom, you can sort of see what they're trying to do in terms of having her be sort of like leader on her own, even though, considering that she was already left from Amashu where she was at the top, she was sort of regulated in her place here by her father, but now she sort of has the hope that she can be sort of the top person later on. And I don't know if this is more along the lines they're trying to set up that, in this version, Azula would do something against her father or something like that, but it definitely does put her in an interesting position where maybe she herself will be sort of the power in charge rather than her father, despite sort of everything he's going with. So I don't know. It's something to see if they're trying to make, sort of more drama within the Fire Nation family, which will get played out later on, when Zuko comes more into the picture of, challenging the throne.
There's a very quick Zuko scene, basically just getting across he thinks he deserves more as a prince, still not accepting his position. But the next scene, I think, is the next important one to talk about. Katara talks to Amita. Amita introduces Katara to the Painted Lady flower, and that it's named after a river spirit, painted in red and gold. She tells this interesting story about how these flowers are effectively used, I guess, by the Painted Lady to warn people of incoming danger. And that's how Amita's family survived in the past. The flowers died, they knew to leave, the Fire Nation then came. The Painted Lady is this spirit who protects people, and this inspires Katara to kind of further want to do the same. And this ends up being Katara's like main only arc over the course of the whole season, and this is one of the most interesting but also kind of like weird decisions that the show makes here, is to turn the Painted Lady, like episode 3 of season 3, into her entire book 2 plot point, as in like we talk about it here in episode 1, and this will continue all the way basically into episode 7. This is the point here. And again, this is like one of her core traits, is wanting to protect people. So, okay, that's fine to do that. It's just, what are we doing here? Because this is meant to be like a Fire Nation spirit. Though, again, they do some stuff in Ba Sing Se to connect it to the Fire Nation, but it's very like, what are we doing here? And like, are you only doing this because you want the cool kind of fun factor of like the Painted Lady and the Blue Spirit interacting, which people have talked about for kind of years? I think Katara is better done this season than the previous season, but it does mostly feel like they do that by just kind of highlighting, look how strong she is. She's a really powerful bender and wants to protect people. And it does feel like that becomes a very simplified plot point for like Katara and Zuko, is just like they want to protect people, and that's like the only thing that they want to say about these characters. We'll get into the Blue Spirit changes, I think, in the next episode, but what are your thoughts on the introduction here of the Painted Lady stuff in the early stages of book 2?
Yeah, I don't know. I was really curious to where this was actually going to go, and I don't know. It's interesting that they're sort of integrating this way because, like, yeah, it's still a river spirit, but it's more just sort of an element that sort of appears that sort of works with anyone, I guess, who can sort of notice this painted lady flower, right? Like, if you're paying attention to it, then you'll sort of understand the things that are going around with you. Which I don't know. I don't feel like that's like the worst way to do it, but clearly this is their way of getting it to work within the confines of how they're sort of altering the story. So it's not going to be just sort of a one-off thing. It's sort of going to be this ongoing thing. And I don't know. I mean, it was a thing that was important to Qatar. So like it kind of makes sense that this would be an important element of her character. But for it to be sort of, taken over in this sort of way, I'm not sure if I like it as much as I would have liked it, compared to sort of the other way, but it has to be, something that works with how they're sort of adjusting sort of the story. So I don't know. I don't know. It's her version of the alter ego, but for an extended period of time, and having it sort of interact with sort of Zuko's alter ego as well. So I don't know. It's an odd one that I think it kind of works, but I don't know. It kind of by the end of it, it kind of irked me, especially how it gets sort of used against her in the end as well.
Yeah, like it's one of those ones where like it feels like it doesn't accomplish as much as it probably needs to. Like it's not as big as they maybe thought it might be in the end, because it is mostly just like extended setup for the Zuko Katara catacomb scene, which still mostly goes down in the exact
Yeah.
same way. And this is just like, oh, she has seen Zuko do something good, so she puts a bit of trust into him, which is broken. Which is it's still in essence the kind of same way that it actually ends up going. Um, we do get another scene of Sokka and Suki talking. Again, we just highlight this idea of there's multiple scenes of this, and we'll get this over like the first 3 episodes of just they go to talk, he creates awkwardness between them and walks off. And she wants the relationship, but he can't really talk about it, and Suki is left confused. Um, I like the Katara Sokka scene we eventually get to in episode 3, I think it is. It might be 4. Um, but it is very much, it is a 1 episode thing extended into multiple episodes. And for Sokka this season, the only thing he really has going on is this and then his dynamic with Sai. And you do notice that, like, oh, yeah, some of the Team Avatar characters, they've not left them a lot for like character work, and you kind of see it when you kind of see moments like this. What are your thoughts on how they do this kind of like extension of the Suki Sokka UA, I guess, dynamic?
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's some odd one because like you can understand his hesitance in doing in getting to another relationship here, and he. I mean, even Suki, like by the end of it, like she realizes sort of what's going on, even if she doesn't know sort of the specifics of it. But I don't know. It feels odd that that would be sort of like his only or one of his only things throughout the season, in terms of what's sort of defining him as a character. And I don't know, maybe they're trying to sort of balance it out from what we've gotten before, but I don't know. And it's weird because he does have like a lot of little moments throughout the whole season here where you can see him, sort of the core of what we would say of his sort of character here, but that is sort of I don't know, it's a standout thing that didn't seem like it needed as much importance, but here it actually has it, which I don't know, maybe they just wanted another element of him to sort of be drawn out throughout the season here, which I don't know, maybe that's just their way of writing things, just like how the Painted Lady is a thing that goes throughout the whole sort of season here. Like they're just sort of need to sort of have a connecting thread line for all of our characters that goes through the whole one. And I think for some of them it works, and for some of them it doesn't work quite as well, at least for me.
Yeah, like it is the kind of challenge in a way with like our main Team Avatar characters is that like their arcs are very much like a moment here, a moment there, combined with learning about their character gradually over the course of all these episodes, which is a little bit different than Zuko, who they're doing pretty well because his big moments happen in specific episodes that can be focused on. Whereas there's not as much of that with some of the other characters. But this is also the thing with the adaptation is that they seem to struggle with how do we sum up like Aang and Katara's arc across these 8 episodes. Well, we'll choose one of those things and just extend it like 4 times longer than it like needs to be, and it feels overly focused and like that you're missing the other bits. We'll get into the Serpent's Pass here. I'll sum this up somewhat quickly because it's mostly the Serpent's Pass as we kind of know it. It's just, it is missing the context of like what the group has just been through from the original. So when they get to the sign, abandon all hope, Aang's not hopeless at this point in time, so he just knocks the sign down and is just like, let's get through this. And they kind of go through, they kind of have little moments here or there. He helps some of the kids. They get through the water section, so Katara and Aang have to do water bending to get through that section. Then they notice the Fire Nation attacking. Then the serpent arrives and attacks them. We do get, Suki's here with the group, of course, and the Kyoshi Warriors, so they go to defend against the serpent. We get some action stuff. Suki gets a little bit injured. Sokka notices this, of course. Katara and Aang work together to like defeat the serpent. With the kind of unique thing here being that Aang gets very worried when they like injure the serpent. He thinks that they might have killed it. He wants Katara to immediately use the Spirit Oasis water, but she instead is like, no, we'll just both do the healing together so it's stronger. And it works. Again, they highlight his hesitancy to do this in the first place, but she guides him through the process and they heal the serpent, and the serpent then leaves in peace. And that is the Serpent's Pass, basically in this version of the show. And we'll get to the kind of after scene in just a second. So this is one of our really early kind of like big action set piece moments. They make one of the bigger CG, I suppose, budget moments of the season. It was in all the trailers and stuff like that. By the end of the season, it feels a little bit weird, and that like is that budget a little bit misplaced? It could have been used elsewhere. Given that some of the context of the Serpent's Pass is a little bit missing here. It's a cool way to start the season, but it's mostly, I think, a relatively okay version of Serpent's Pass. But what are your thoughts on this whole sequence here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's again, this is one where I'm trying not to compare it to sort of the original one because they've changed everything, in terms of how they go through the water and stuff like that, and just the people that they have part of the team, like there's no Toph at all here. So I don't know. I think, seeing it and everything, like the action and everything, I think it's totally fine. Like, I like, I think they did a cool bit, with Katara jumping in and sort of helping out with things. Suki be involved with it. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's really just there as sort of an element towards, having a connecting thread line for Sokka to be concerned with Suki. It's really like the only idea I can see for having Suki being directly involved with this, because with such a large creature, like I don't know, it seems like she wouldn't be involved with this at all unless she's like rescuing someone who's in danger. So I don't know, that part felt odd to me. But the serpent itself is fine. Like, I mean, did it deserve to have this much emphasis in terms of the episode and the budgets and stuff like that? I don't know. Maybe it did. I mean, it was a cool piece, I guess, and it looked good. So it was cool to sort of have it there. But I don't know, it's one of those things where it's a cool bit, but it doesn't feel sort of as important to the series overall. Like, it doesn't have, as much importance. Like, it doesn't really come back. Like, there wasn't even like as much of a precursor to having the serpent there and stuff like that. Like, there felt like there was a lot more towards having it there in the original one compared to what we're sort of seeing here. But otherwise, I think it works well enough, and it does give another issue with Aang and sort of his healing and how that can work overall, which, again, him being hesitant on healing, I don't know, I'm still torn on that because it feels like it's something that he would be all about if he has that ability or if he can learn it. So that part I'm still always sort of, iffy on that being such a prominent thing here, but I am glad that he does get to learn it and that he does sort of, seemingly get over it here. So I really hope that does come into play later on. Otherwise, it'll feel sort of like a bit here that doesn't really have as much importance as they're sort of gathering it towards. But otherwise, I think it's a cool set piece that they actually have here.
Yeah, like you sort of start to bring in like other moments that they didn't do. So like a lot of people are probably going to mention like the drill. They just don't do the drill like at all. That could have been a big CG thing to do. Aang learning earthbending. They could have done the saber-toothed moose lion cub and actual saber-toothed moose lion as like the scene to get him activating his earthbending rather than the scene that they did. There's a moment where we referenced Toph learning from the badger moles. We don't cut out to show that. That could have been... I think that probably is maybe where some of that CG budget maybe could have been better used, because that scene's very exposition focused when we get to it. There's stuff like that I think are kind of like interesting, and that like, yeah, this being done slightly out of sequence makes this episode maybe not feel as kind of like an important in some ways, especially because we ultimately like later on in the season get Aang to the point where like he is feeling a little bit hopeless, but he doesn't have the Serpent's Pass coming up next. It's more drama kind of focus what they end up doing, and it kind of feels like that's where some of their decision making with what's where feels a bit weird. We do get to some character moments though after this. Aang thanks Katara. He feels like, she's the perfect person to kind of get him out of the ice, and there's a sense that he wants to say more to her, but like she kind of walks off before he can kind of put the words together. We do this a few times over the course of the season. This is effectively our introduction to like Katang in this show, in terms of what we're doing here, which is that we do this a few times. He is about to sort of confess to her, and in this case I think she just doesn't sense what's happening and just walks off, and it's kind of pretty normal. As the scenes, it seems like, goes on, she more has the idea of like, I think I know what he's going to say, and is kind of like, I'm a little bit worried, but I'm also kind of like, what's he going to say? So it feels like they're just doing what is kind of like the classic, just kind of like teen romance drama kind of like writing stuff here, of just they're very awkward, they don't know what to say to each other, as the kind of approach here versus the way they did it in the original. It seems to be the way they do most of the romance in this show, is just kind of very like everything's awkward. At least they're doing something with that, because that was a bit of an issue with like season 1. It's just like they didn't address it like at all. Katara heals Suki's arm. Suki offers Katara to join the Kyoshi warriors. She's just basically happy to be acknowledged. Again, this doesn't obviously go anywhere. It'll be brought up in a later episode, mostly with the idea of, Katara just being noted by other people as being like really skilled and kind of like, in demand to a certain degree. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of these kind of character scenes that we have here after the Serpent's Pass?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it feels like it's decent setup for what they're trying to do with the relationships. Like, I guess, you can see his hesitance and the awkwardness. So I think that's pretty much sort of like on par with what we've, come to know of these characters here. And I don't know, Katara being sort of noted for her abilities here, I think it's nice. I think it's nice for her to sort of be acknowledged. I think when we sort of see some other stuff, especially with the Painted Lady later on, I don't know if that's enough for me to fully buy into her sort of being a Kyoshi warrior in that sort of way. Even if Kyoshi was, a waterbender, but she's the Avatar, so that's completely different in terms of like her ability and her sort of skill set here. But it's a nice moment regardless there. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's cool here, and even other little bits like we got Sokka and Aang here. I think that's also a very nice moment here, is sort of coming down from everything and the hype of sort of fighting the serpent. So I don't know. I think some of these little moments are actually pretty nice. In terms of what they're trying to build for our characters.
Yeah. The Sokka Aang scene, I think, actually does pretty decent work. It highlights their dynamic, I think, pretty well. Like, Sokka as the sort of planning sort of leader of the group comes over, and it's just like, you did really well there, Aang. Like, you were a leader. You were like charismatic there. They get to like referencing like, I'm sorry about the whole Avatar state thing. I know you kind of feel weird about that. This is the plot thread for the Avatar state this season. It is not about attachment. It is not about the sort of way in which it's unlocked. It's just, am I in control during it? I will only use it if I have full control. That's sort of the idea. So he doesn't want to be just kind of set loose against the enemy type thing, because look at what happened in the north. They then switch it back to Sokka's point of just like, oh, hey, I opened up to you, Sokka. You can open up to me if you want to. About UA, maybe. Nope. And he kind of walks off. So furthering the kind of like setup there, that was I think pretty nice. There's another quick scene of Zuko kind of nearly starting a fight. There is a setup, I think, for the finale kind of scene here of like the owner says like, "Oh, get your son in line," kind of like Mushi or whatever. And Zuko clearly doesn't like that when we kind of get back around to him. We then address the comet. Sai explains that the Great Comet, Sozin's Comet, is returning. And they immediately know this will end the war because of what happened the first time out. His estimate right now, very early estimate, is a few months to a year when it will actually return, which makes sense. And yeah, they're going to have to go to Ba Sing Se to form a plan with the Earth King immediately. So the timeline is suddenly placed on the series here. We had to wait until after they actually got confirmed for season 2 to do this. That's the whole reasoning we're getting this here. So that all kind of makes sense. And then afterwards, Sai and Amita have a kind of interesting kind of a moment, suggesting a bit of a kind of burgeoning romance between those two. This, because of what they end up doing with like the Dai Li and stuff like this, it doesn't get to be focused on all that much outside of like this, and I think a little bit in the next episode. But it's like, oh, it's nice enough. And then, yeah, Sokka Suki have another moment. This time they don't speak. They just kind of hold hands. And it's like, you know, the relationship is still good. It's just Sokka needs to kind of have his kind of growth, I suppose, is sort of the idea. But, yeah, what are your thoughts on the, I suppose, the comet kind of explanation moment here?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I know it's odd that we're getting it, in this sort of way here, but, I guess from what we've seen before from his character and his research and his working with Fire Nation and being in, Washu and stuff like that, like, I guess it kind of makes sense that he would be the one to sort of have the information, as sort of like, the scientist, the tech person, the mechanist sort of, character of the series, being able to understand things, even if he was sort of limited before because of the environment that he was in. So I guess that, it works and it pushes the story forward. I like that, at least now we have sort of like a direct goal, a direction of what we're doing, and Aang's able to sort of, take charge in terms of what he thinks the group should do and, be sort of, more of the leader that was just sort of mentioned when he was having the conversation with Sokka here. So I like that it does sort of push the thing back. So I think, these sort of little moments here, that's more of an important moment, but our little moments here that we have with our characters here, the Mechanist and Amida and sort of, even Sokka and Suki, I think, these are sort of the nice little moments that, I think for the most part work pretty well. Even sort of, the little bit that we have there with like, Zuko and Iroh there, they're sort of the connecting tissue of parts that sort of build up to what they're sort of going for later on. Sort of, for the most part, I think these elements work for me.
Mm-hmm. And there's another quick Aang Katara scene where he kind of does the same thing as before. He's about to tell her something, but can't quite get it out yet. Then we get back to Azula. This time she is with May and Ty Lee, and they discuss basically Ozai's treatment of Azula, sending her out on this mission. And we kind of off-screen, kind of like in the explanation here, just highlight that, oh yeah, Azula rescued Ty Lee from the circus, and May gives some dialogue referencing the idea that her father runs New Ozai Omashu. But we don't show that happening. So a little bit of a weird one here where like I think that would have been nice to see, but it also kind of still ends up feeling a little bit weird where like, oh yeah, they were together before, but that was like 2 years ago. Then Ty Lee went off to the circus. Them doing it in this way kind of begs more questions than kind of answers, which is kind of a little bit weird in the way it's kind of done here, but it's fine. She decides to test the loyalty of her friends here. She asks how May feels about Zuko because she knows she had a crush on him in the past. May basically gives this very logical answer that like if you and Zuko were drowning, I would save Zuko, but it's because I know you would never be in that situation. Like no one would ever need to save you, where Zuko kind of does need to be saved. Azula notes that like that's a logical answer, not a kind of feelings answer. So further wants to test them, and it basically is like, hey, you two kill each other. She then starts a countdown timer because she's going to kill them, And so, yeah, they are forced into fighting each other here. Azula does stop it right before they actually do anything to each other, but she gets what she wants out of this. They're loyal to her. She is controlling them through fear. That's sort of the idea here. And they're going after the Avatar. My thoughts with this scene are just that it feels a little bit blunt, even though it's probably like an actual aspect of their relationship that we just maybe haven't like massively focused on. But I think the original does do this a lot better. Like the more sort of subtle threat of Azula like attending Ty Lee's circus performance and upping the danger as like getting across the same thing, rather than the very blunt, oh yeah, you two kill each other. That's kind of, I think, the kind of slight problem here is just that, like, for whatever reason, May and Ty Lee are not being done super well here, and it's mostly on the writers, I think, just like making some odd choices with whatever they're doing here. In that, like, I just think they chose to focus these initial Team Azula scenes on kind of the wrong things. But what did you think of how they do the introduction of like the team going after Zuko here, basically?
No, I think I felt very similar in terms of, is this sort of the best way to show the dynamic of the group going forward here, and just that they're, as of now, they're loyal to her for, basically through fear here, and, no other reason other than that they, maybe they had some camaraderie sort of in the past. So that's not a factor anymore. And I don't know if this is because of the way that they're positioning Azula in the series, or just because of how they're interpreting her character would act in sort of like a live action environment compared to sort of like an animated environment. Because I think it comes across pretty clear that this Azula is, very sort of, cutthroat and to the point of what she's sort of doing. Like, maybe she doesn't have, sort of the subtlety that you was mentioning that she sort of had in the original one, which I think, maybe that's, a fallacy of trying to compare it to the original one. But even without that sort of in mind, I think it comes across pretty clear that this Azula is very sort of direct and sort of, I don't know, evil, psycho, whatever you want to consider her compared to what we sort of have seen before, just in general of her character in general. Like, she's just, very sort of, all right, I'm done with dealing with whatever the issue is. I'm not going to try for the more subtle approach. I'm just going to sort of go for it. Like, she starts off with it being sort of subtle, but then she like runs out of patience, which, that sort of feels like a thing that Zuko has, or that he's always had. Like, he's been sort of the typical sort of like hot-headed character, and Zula's been sort of the opposite of it. She's still ruthless and conniving and all that sort of stuff, but she can sort of, she can see sort of the bigger picture a little bit better, where Zuko hasn't really been able to see that. But in this one, it definitely feels like she's just like, all right, I'm just gonna sort of do this. Especially later on, where we see her sort of in the Earth Kingdom, and she's like, yeah, we're just gonna do this sort of the direct way. Like, she's not even going to like attempt to do something a bit more subtle that'll get her the same sort of result here. So I don't know. I mean, I think it comes across what you're sort of going for here, and it's interesting to see how this plays out later on with Ty Lee and May, and their sort of unique relationship later on. So I don't know. It's definitely something to sort of keep in mind as the series goes on.
Mm-hmm. And then the last scene of the episode is kind of it's a pretty lengthy scene. It's because this is the setup for Zuko alone. This is the scene where Zuko goes off on his own, leaving Iroh behind. And again, because of the kind of quicker setup, this has to be Zuko's plot from like 5-6 episodes kind of condensed together. I guess they felt that they had to do this in a much more kind of like blunt, brutal way, because of the harshness of the things Zuko says here are kind of quite kind of crazy. But it's a nice scene. I think there's some interesting stuff in this. So Zuko is holding his top knot, which he's obviously cut off. That explains the different hairstyle this time out. As Iroh comes to talk, Iroh wants to highlight the simple joy in this new life that they have, that they could start something new. Iroh wants to open a tea stall. He'll teach Zuko those skills if he wants. The right cup of tea at the right moment can change your life. And he mentions here, this is interesting, that this is how Iroh met Zarina and fell in love. So Zarina is the name of Iroh's wife, which is interesting. I assume they probably maybe worked with Avatar Studios to come up with that name, but we'll have to wait and see. And basically, he just asks Zuko not to squander this chance. Zuko then gets quite harsh with Iroh saying, "I'm not your son. I can't stand your smiles, your jokes." You know, the way he's quite nice with Earth Kingdom people who would hate him if they knew who he was. Iroh says that he chooses to be happy, to try and spread joy. But Zuko says that Iroh doesn't deserve joy, and that all of this is Iroh's fault. He blames his entire circumstance on Iroh, which Iroh's a little bit taken aback by. But basically, Zuko's logic here is that Iroh was meant to be Fire Lord, but he broke. He failed at the siege of Ba Sing Se and didn't stand up to Ozai when Ozai took the throne. And none of this would have happened if Iroh was on the throne, and this would have prevented Ozai from being on the throne and doing everything he did to his family. And he highlights Iroh's weakness in all of this. Iroh notes that like Lu Ten died. This is why it all happened. But Zuko just says, "What would he think of you if he could see you now?" And then he walks off, Zuko alone, leaving Iroh behind. It's accelerated. It's more kind of aggressive. It's more blunt. It still, I think, gets the point across, and I think a really interesting way. Some of the angles that I think they take on things here. Like the original, Lu Ten, I think, remains this kind of interesting kind of enigma of a character where, like, they, in the main content, kind of don't really characterize him. So, like, when Zuko says, like, "What would he think of you if he could see you now?" I'm kind of like, I think he'd be okay with it based on what we know about Lu Ten. And it feels like a little bit kind of, like, slightly odd there. But a lot of the other stuff of, like, Zuko more directly talking to Iroh about this kind of past and like having a more negative view on it, it's kind of interesting given that Zuko's in a very negative kind of mindset. But what were your thoughts on them setting up Zuko alone in this way?
Yeah, I think, for the most part, you get the idea that, Zuko's just very upset with his station in life. And, from his perspective, Iroh is sort of the beginning of all of his sort of issues here. Now, that's not necessarily true, and we get to see him sort of, backtrack on some of these things later on. But in this moment here, I think you can understand the point where Zuko's coming from, even if it doesn't really, even if things aren't exactly sort of like one-to-one, that this led to this led to that, in that sort of fashion there. But I think, for them having this sort of speed up this process here, I think you can see the effect that it has on Iroh. You can clearly hear sort of the emphasis in Zuko's voice here and the dialogue here. So I think it's, it's done pretty well here. And I think, it's something of note that this does sort of, even if, Iroh is trying to sort of come to terms with things, you can see that this does, in some regard, affect Iroh, later on in the season. And that's, I don't know, I thought it was interesting how that gets to be played in, which is something that we didn't really see, as much hesitance from Iroh in the original series. So that's, something that, I don't know, I think might be, cool to see how they actually took that perspective of everything that he's done in the past and how, people really wouldn't be sort of as friendly with him if they knew sort of anything about him. But, the same would be said of Zuko, right? Like, and Zuko hasn't really done anything. Like, he's, only 16 or whatever. So, like, he hasn't actually been in any sort of wars. Like, even the things that sort of, like, Katara accuses him of later on, like, he hasn't really done any of that stuff because he's basically the same age as him and hasn't been involved in those wars. So, I don't know. It's definitely something to see them sort of push this sort of topic pretty forward, pretty fast here. But I think it works in terms of getting Zuko on his own, being alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the interesting thing about this show's version of Iroh is that the timeline is a bit like more condensed with it, whereas in the original the siege is like 10 years ago. In this version of the show, the siege is like, I don't know, 3 years ago, because the flashbacks we're going to get into in episode 2, it's clearly a really, really young Zuko. But Zuko at Lu Ten's funeral is like basically just prior to his banishment, basically. So that's the kind of main difference we're doing here, is that we're actually going to explore some of Iroh's kind of journey to get to being the person he is in, like, at the start of the like original show, basically. So this is why we do things in the kind of way we do them here, and it's an interesting one here. Like this is where like it actually works reasonably well, because I think you can tell they write a lot of the Iroh scenes with like a lot of respect and don't just kind of like throw the scenes together like they maybe do with some of the other characters. So it ends up actually working out okay. But we'll move into episode 2, which is called A Fight Once Begun. This is an interesting one. I'll do some general thoughts here on this one. I think this is a mostly like really solid episode. It's actually a fairly nice adaptation of like what Blind Bandit, Zuko Alone, and The Chase kind of all thrown together. So it's episodes that are in the right order. They cut off like the like maybe not needed portion of The Chase. Like did we need the sleep deprivation plot here? This show doesn't have the time to do that. That's fine. The big moment at the end is what you need. And yeah, it's actually mixed together in a pretty nice way, ultimately. Similarly, they actually mix some of the Zuko Alone sequences together pretty nicely. Condensing a few characters into one group of characters. Weirdly, I think the weakness of this episode is the thing I expected to maybe be the strongest, and that's actually the flashbacks. The Zuko Alone flashbacks, I think, are not the most effective thing in the world, and I think they're a lot better in the original than they are here. Again, they're clearly doing something different here, but for such a notable episode, and then Zuko's been done really well, I just find it interesting that, like, actually it doesn't kind of quite work as well here, because they actually don't do as much of the flashback as you maybe expect them to. But what are your overall thoughts on episode 2?
Yeah, no, it's for the most part, I think, like you're saying there, the combination of multiple episodes in one, for the most part, I think works pretty well. I think, I do enjoy Zuko as sort of the real timeline here in terms of him sort of interacting with people that, would be, typically considered below his station, and getting to understand them even a little bit, even though, by the end of things, he's still sort of like, completely, not with this sort of mentality or anything like that, but he's, it seems like he's a bit more sort of aware of it, which I think is what they're trying to do with the flashbacks with his mom and everything like that, in terms of, him having compassion and having courage and that sort of stuff. But I don't know, sometimes they're just a little bit too little, or maybe because they're sort of broken up over the course of the episode, they don't sort of quite hit as strong as they might have, in another sort of format here. I don't know. But I think, overall, the elements that they have in this episode are pretty cool. I think it definitely gets across what they're sort of going for, and introducing, new characters and having characters interact with each other that we haven't really seen before. So there definitely is a lot in this episode, which I think, keeps it moving pretty well for the most part throughout most of the episode.
Mm-hmm. So, we start off, the immediate first scene is that Zuko steals from Ying, who is pregnant, I guess, with Hope. And they do kind of cover that arc like a little bit over the course of this. So this is meant to be this kind of like really kind of like, this is him at his kind of like worst moment here, is that he goes to steal, realizes he's going to be stealing from a pregnant woman, and still ends up doing it anyway. And they placed, I think, even more importance on this because, like, of the way they do the blue spirit, and the idea is that the blue spirit is not meant to be like greedy as well. He then comes across soldiers taking advantage of civilians, and steps in to defend this boy whose name is Peng. And this is where we immediately see that the adaptation approach here is actually that we are combining Song and her family with what was it, like Thon, Lee, that whole family, the actual Zuko Alone family. And I actually think this works really well here. Peng and his sister Faye is a pretty nice amalgamation of this, given that like the show doesn't have the time to have him go over here and meet this one family and then go over here and then meet this other family. It has to be a little bit more kind of concise. So we'll get into the details as we go forward here. But yeah, you see here the the Earth Kingdom soldiers, are they real soldiers, just taking advantage of people, is exactly the Zuko alone setup. So what are your thoughts on the opening sequence here?
Oh, I like it. I think, for the most part, it's heartbreaking and, hard to see Zuko sort of steal from the family there. But then you get to see him, right immediately after it do something that's pretty positive, right? So it's like, you can see the conflict of what he's doing and how that's going to play into, him sort of going on his own, even though he's still trying to sort of essentially capture the Avatar to regain, what he wants in life here. So yeah, it's something to see him sort of have this, this struggle while being sort of super hungry and wanting to eat, right? Because that's sort of the problem that he has throughout this whole time.
This leads into the first flashback, where Azula throws stones at turtle ducks. Zuko steps in to defend the turtle ducks. Azula's then about to like smash Zuko in the face with like a hot rock. She's just like firebend, and Ursa appears, basically suggesting that they settled their disputes with respect. Ozai then arrives and is just like, ignore that. That's not how we do things here. A fight once begun only ends when one wins and one loses, of course. He wants the strength of the Fire Nation, there to be a winner and a loser. Who is strong, who is weak. And yeah, Azula just goes up and punches Zuko, kind of knocks him down, and the idea is we know who the winner and the loser is in this relationship at this point in time, and that's kind of the way it is. Again, this scene I think is functional, but you can see it's a little bit more like blunt, kind of like heavy-handed compared to the original, where like in the original we never see Azula actually like throw a thing at a turtle duck. It's something Zuko says he saw Azula do, and then he mimics, and Zuko gets like kind of slightly punished for kind of doing that, and it implies kind of Azula's kind of bad behavior, and they're a little bit more like, okay, we want to present Zuko more clearly as the kind of protector, kind of really obviously, and that's one way to do it. And then the thing they're really emphasizing in this live action version is definitely that whole idea of Ozai views Zuko as being weak, and certainly that's what's got across here. So yeah, mostly fine. It's just sometimes they lose a little bit of the nuance of the way they do the adaptation. But what are your thoughts on our first time seeing Ursa here?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was cool to get to see her here and how she plays here, because I definitely feel like she tries to have more of a stronger, importance and role in this compared to what we've seen before. So I do like that sort of aspect of her here. It's just unfortunate that, Ozai is just sort of as overbearing as we would expect him to be, and maybe even more so here in terms of, his children here and how he's sort of raising them to sort of basically compete with each other all the time here. So I think, it definitely is sort of, very direct, very sort of stark contrast in terms of, what our younger versions of our brother and sister duo here are interacting with each other here. Because I don't know, it's weird. At some points, I feel like they make Azula feel like, okay, she's more sort of in line with what, might be sort of the better sides of things here. But, clearly, as a child, she's being sort of pushed towards this other direction, which we can see where she ends up with that eventually.
Mm-hmm. This version of Ursa, based on what they kind of say later on, it seems like the arranged marriage is not arranged in as kind of like shady of circumstances as it was before. It feels like it's more of a normal nobility type thing. So Ursa has like a bit more sort of, I suppose, like, I don't know, power within the dynamic, but not that much more than the kind of original. So we're kind of seeing that a bit more. Next, Zuko deals with the soldiers by basically just highlighting their breaches in procedure and uniform, and he just stands his ground and they walk off because they're not like proper soldiers. So Pang is pretty impressed by this and basically offers to bring him home for dinner. One interesting line is that he does mention his own brother, Sensu, so that's a cool reference to that, is stationed in Bin which of course is one of the Shang cities from the Yang Chen novel, so they're using some novel references here, which is kind of nice. So yeah, this scene is like mostly fine. It's mostly, I think, set up on that side of things. Suki talks to Sokka kind of up next. We get another one of those ones. Katara kind of joins them. There's some talk about Jings once again because they need to find the right earthbending teacher. Suki does show Katara how to throw the correct punch, the correct form for a punch, which is set up for later on. There's a somewhat nice Aang moment here where he's really excited to go to the next town because they have the world's biggest croco rhino egg. And Sokka tells Suki to be careful. So there's a bunch of setup for like a lot of the main dynamics that we're doing kind of at this point in time. It mostly kind of works. Leading to the next kind of maybe Azula May Ty Lee scene that again I maybe have some issues with in terms of just like, oh, we're just being very clear about May and Ty Lee being like right there and okay with participating in basically killing civilians and stuff like that. It also feels like a bit of a like not overly needed scene because all they get out of this is just they get a vague direction in which the Avatar has gone in. And it's just like this is just meant to show how like cruel Azula is, and that's basically it. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of the kind of establishing kind of scenes here as we kind of start the episode?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. This is essentially this scene with Azula and the three of them is just to sort of show that they're, they don't really have any compassion for anyone who's not Fire Nation or who's getting in their way in terms of their goals here, which I think is, that's fine if that's the way they're going for here. I mean, the whole thing is, again, it's a live action. They're adapting it. It's going for this sort of flavor of things. It has that sort of darker tone of things. So we just have to sort of keep that in mind, regardless of any other sort of pre-existing sort of ideas that we might have towards the thing. But no, I think it works pretty well. And being excited about, this random thing that feels sort of in line with what I have in my mind about his character. Although in this series, that's not exactly what I have in mind for him overall. I don't know. The typical sort of whimsicalness of his character, I think, considering how they're sort of positioning this series and this season overall, doesn't quite work as well for me as I thought it might have, or I would have expected it to be. So, that's something to sort of keep in mind. But there's still, some fun little moments here. Sokka telling Appa to sort of watch over things here. So there still is sort of some fun overall, which I don't know, maybe they could use more of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the setup here is that this is kind of meant to be, I suppose, like Aang wants to ride an animal style moment, but they don't want to show an animal with the CG budget, so it's just here's an animal kind of related thing. It gets across the point for Aang, but like you can see kind of very clearly what they're doing. Next, we meet Peng's sister. So we meet Faye here. So she's kind of thankful Zuko has helped like safely escort her brother home. She's obviously kind of sort of skeptical because it's like a stranger. But she kind of realizes like, oh, Peng seems really kind of set on like giving him dinner. I guess we'll go ahead with this. But she is a little bit kind of cautious here. But this will kind of develop as kind of things go on. We see the Croco Rhino egg when we get to Kuti Village is the name of the location here. So again, we're not in Gaoling. Dialogue later kind of explains that. We are in a different location here. The Beifongs will still be here, but we're in Kuti Village. The main thing they get across here is just that the team needs money because no one gives air nomads alms anymore. And they don't quite get that whole situation. But yeah, they learn about Earth Rumble here in the way we expect them to. Qatar gets the information from the mean boys, and they mostly get across the main things that they had to do. From these two scenes, I would say like I actually quite like the presentation of Faye as a character. So I think they did pretty good like writing work with her, and the scenes actually work quite nicely to the point where this is a much better kind of early romantic kind of thing for Zuko than I think this show's version of Jin, which we get later on. But what are your thoughts on these scenes?
I agree with that. I really liked her sort of character, her sort of hesitance of things, and especially, over the course of the episode, how they sort of build upon that. I think actually worked pretty well. Like despite, how things end up, it seems like one that could sort of work out, if, everything went the best way possible. But yeah, and then, Aang getting into the city. I don't know, this is one of those things where like, they're trying to build on Aang's naivety in terms of like the world works compared to how it used to work, with him sort of thinking that, people would just sort of support the airbenders and sort of what their goals are and their sort of like, their general sort of outreach towards people, which I don't know. I feel like if this was sort of like a period of time when he's sort of been like in the world and sort of has learning how the world works in this sort of era, that he would sort of like already know that that's not like a thing that could be done, that he needs money. Like even Sokka seems like he's like, you thought you could just like get stuff, like, even him being from sort of like a remote sort of boony place, you know, sort of could understand that that's not sort of how things work. So I don't know. I get what they're trying to do in terms of Aang here, but sometimes it still doesn't quite work for me as well as I think it might. But I do like that they're able to figure out the arena information. Like that's always sort of a fun thing to see how they interpret that.
Next we cut back to Peng, Zuko, and Faye at the kind of the dinner. Faye does begin to open up when she realizes he's actually okay. She asks if he's heading for Kuti Village. He says no, he's looking for someone he used to fight with. And she kind of counters with the idea of like, if that's the case, then why don't you want to find him? So it's kind of revealed in this moment that he's a little bit conflicted about the whole idea of like, yeah, am I just out here looking for the Avatar, or am I looking for something else? Like, he is a bit lost, is the kind of point that is being made in all of this. He's trying to figure out on his own what he's doing. So yeah, he's allowed to stay in the barn, but when he goes down to sleep, he kind of comes across one of the things he stole, which is basically a kind of kid's toy, because the woman is pregnant, she's preparing for that, she has a toy on her, and the full reality, I suppose, of what he did kind of is revealed to him. It's also meant to be, I suppose, a little bit of a contrast between like the dynamic here with Faye and her brothers going so well, but what did he just do like the day before type thing. He's going back and forth about these things. So this stuff is all very, I think, effective in terms of what it's trying to do. But what were your thoughts on this scene with Zuko and Faye?
I thought this was a nice sort of, him sort of attempting to sort of understand where he's at in life and sort of what, sort of progress he's trying to do on this sort of solo journey here. And he's conflicted. I think, it comes across pretty clear that he's been doing things that he doesn't quite enjoy and some things that, has been more towards a positive. So I think it's a good back and forth for his character, which is the whole point of him being on this sort of solo journey, is to question things.
Next, we cut to a flashback once again, and this is kind of an important one and an interesting one. Ursa talks to Zuko after the events of what just happened. He thinks he's a loser. She's proud of him for being courageous and standing up for what's right. She asks him who else protects the innocent. The Blue Spirit. So she tells the story of the Blue Spirit, this show's version of the Blue Spirit. Still has two swords, still has a mask, but also a heart untainted by hate or greed. A quote from the Blue Spirit is apparently, I will protect them no matter the cost to me. And they kind of get across the idea that like it's unknown if like this is a person who like was a spirit or was kind of like blessed by the spirits for doing kind of good things. And the other aspect of this scene is that they kind of linger on Ursa as she says the Blue Spirit line, with the idea of like, oh, Ursa, what's she going to have to do to protect her children from the situation that she's in, not just the significance of the whole protector thing to Zuko. So this actually ends up being like one of the bigger changes that the show makes in terms of just taking what the Blue Spirit is in literally the opposite direction. In the original, the Blue Spirit is like the villain of Love Amongst the Dragons. And it's meant to represent kind of like Zuko at his worst, that he takes on this alter ego who kind of is the loser, and he fully kind of embodies that. Whereas here, the Blue Spirit is this like aspirational hero protector character who Zuko needs to grow to be, basically. I find it interesting, but I think it's, again, some of the lack of nuance being kind of put into play here, where like in this case you actually have extra source material from the comics to like expand on this, and I think they choose to take a very simplistic road with this of just, again, the whole Painted Lady Blue Spirit stuff of just like, oh wow, they're both protecting people. That's the whole point we're trying to make here. It fits for Zuko. I think they had the time and ability to kind of do this accurately and make it work. Because in this version of the show, it makes the blue spirit something that, like, oh, well, I guess he never needs to discard the mask because it can always be a thing that, like, makes him better. Whereas in the original, it's a part of his arc for him to discard the mask and this alter ego because he grows past it. So it comes across to me as a little bit of like, do you guys fully get the Zuko arc? I'm not sure you do on the basis of this. And that, like, again, the protector thing could be presented without needing to lean it into the blue spirit. But, you know, it's not, I don't hate it. It's just one of the bigger changes that I'm just like, I don't think you needed to do this. But what are your thoughts on this scene here?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just sort of how they try to use it in the end. Like, I think if he had some ability to sort of like build himself into the blue spirit character and not needing Max because he is the blue spirit, then, you know, this sort of, you know, alteration on the story would have worked perfectly fine. But because it's sort of something that eventually he has to sort of like discard regardless of anything, that it doesn't, you know, quite have the foothold on us and make it sort of seem as cool as it might be. I guess, you know, they're trying to make it seem cool just because it's a thing that he does to sort of help people, and that's a cool thing to do, right? Like, that's something you could see being an interesting thing, you know, basically being a superhero, essentially. But, you know, since we don't quite get that sort of resolution by the end of things, no, it kind of sort of falls flat with their sort of changes for it. I mean, I think, you know, in terms of it being like a courageous thing and sort of, you know, you have to do what you have to do in order to do the sort of right thing. In terms of Ursa, I think, you know, okay, I get that, especially with what we see she attempts to do with her children. I think, you know, she builds into that sort of idea of a character, even if it doesn't work out for her. But for Zuko, you know, it's just something that I guess he's supposed to always sort of keep in his mind, and that's supposed to like sort of lead him towards maybe the right path because his mom's sort of on the right side of the divide of, you know, him being sort of like a good person and a good character. I guess that kind of works in terms of what they're trying to go, but it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't feel sort of as strong as it could be, I guess is my end guess with that, or my end thoughts.
Yeah, like it feels stronger with Zuko that it's just like, you know, remember who you are is just intrinsically you're a good person rather than remember who you are because you want to be the blue spirit type thing. But anyway, we move on. We get to the Earth Rumble. We see the boulder here. He wins his match. They put out the call, of course, they're here for money, for someone to challenge the boulder. Aang's kind of psyching himself up, not really ready for this, but the blind bandit arrives first. So we get our Toph introduction here. And yeah, this is pretty spot on. I think everyone's basically been praising the casting here, the performance. It's really, really well done. Yeah, she kind of easily wins the fight with the boulder. It is slightly expanded here, where like they just do a little bit more before she eventually kind of like fully wins. We do get to see how this show visualizes Toph's like vision or seismic sense. And the whole idea, yeah, she emphasizes waiting before listening, waiting and listening before attacking. And counters, and that's how she wins. There's a little bit of a fun moment where like you temporarily for a moment think that the boulder has like squished Toph and everyone has a reaction to that, but you know, she breaks out and pretty easily defeats him here. But as Aang moves to talk to Toph to get her to teach him, she leaves because she senses her family's secretary Ji Shen arriving. So that's a kind of interesting point here. But yeah, the Toph stuff I think is ultimately pretty well done. And I think Toph was always going to be fairly, I think, easy to do in adaptation because it feels like whereas they struggle with, I think, some of the other Team Avatar characters, Toph, I think, being a character where they have clear moments where they focus on her allows for an easier adaptation in that, like, yeah, you do the Toph introduction episode well, and you've done most of the work, and then you hit a few key beats as you go forward, and you mostly have it. And I think, yeah, in this case, it feels like they mostly won with some pretty good casting, and the adaptation is fairly, I think, solid here. Like, you can complain about like, oh, like the boulder, should he kind of look more like the rock or something like that? Whereas it almost comes across like this version of the boulder is like a mix of the boulder and the hippo together. Given some of the changes that they'll make as well, where like we have Zinfu here, but we don't use him in the exact same way either. But it's mostly, I think, pretty solid here for the intro scene. But yeah, what were your thoughts on Toph being introduced into live action? First time ever, because we at least have another version of season 1, but not season 2.
Yeah, no, I think, for the most part, her introduction, I think, was done pretty well. I think, she's an interesting character. She's very sort of skilled. We can see the wait and listen. We got the seismic sense. So I think the introduction for her, in this part here, in sort of the battle version of Toph, I think is pretty well. And even later on, I think is pretty well. I think maybe later on this season, there was some points where I was like, I feel it's a bit sort of odd the way that they're talking about Toph, or the way that she says things, or the way other people are reacting to her. But I think, no, I don't have any sort of, major issues with the introduction of her for the most part.
Ji Shen invites Team Avatar to the Beifong Manor, kind of highlighting that the Beifongs have relations with past avatars, so they want the same with Aang, and they take the offer to go to meet with the Beifongs, because they might be able to get money, help the refugees. So that's just a quick scene there to set up how we get to the Beifongs. Back with Faye and Zuko, she wakes up and finds Zuko on the roof kind of repairing it, so Zuko's making sure to kind of do stuff to kind of like earn his stay there. And we see that she's very much turned around kind of completely on him. She kind of wants him to stay. She says like there's a lot to fix, and there's a slight hint of like, ooh, is there actually romantic kind of feelings beginning to develop here? So it's pretty well done, even though this is kind of one of the more kind of simple to the point scenes on this side of the episode. And then also we then cut over to Azula and Co. They find Sky Bison Fur and Prince, and this is how we split up this group here to set up the end of the chase stuff with them. Mei and Ty Lee facing the rest of the team as Azula immediately confronts Aang and Zuko here. We do actually get some characterization for Mei here, kind of, it feels like at last, where she worries that Azula on her own will just go into the town and burn it down, and is like, hey, please don't do this, you're not going to do that, right? And Azula just says no, but basically gets around to the idea of like, but I might do it if I feel I have to. So it was, I think, something that felt like one of the more maybe Mei related kind of scenes, but it's still not quite maybe clicking with all these characters in terms of the exact way the dynamics being done. But what are your thoughts on this couple of scenes here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, I don't know, it feels like it's still sort of the sort of typical sort of like our May type character, and Ty Lee's still pretty bubbly, and so that's sort of what we expect here. But yeah, I think we just. I think they're really just trying to get across the point that Azula can really sort of be sort of like on a hair trigger. Like she has for what we have come to consider her with a character that has pretty much control on the situation. It's pretty much sort of already sort of at ends of having like true control on herself, which is unfortunate, or just different in terms of like where we would expect her to be at this point in the season. But again, it's a different show. They're doing things in a different way, so maybe it'll work out, in later seasons that this will make more sense the way that they've done it here. But no, I think for the most part, these sort of little scenes that we have here, Zuko sort of trying to sort of earn his keep here. This is like, when we're like, okay, he can do, the right thing, the good thing, and there's, maybe something more that he could be here. Of course, it's just a setup for him being sort of like dragged away eventually, which is, sort of par for the course for his character. So that's a good setup there.
Mm-hmm. So we get to the Beifong Manor. We have some cool introduction stuff here as we see the portraits of the Beifongs from eras past with the other avatars. They highlight very clearly on screen Yangchen, Kuruk, Kyoshi, and Roku. But at the start of the scene, you can also see that there is a Zito one as well, which is kind of fun. But the whole point that they set up here is that, they don't have an Aang portrait. They're going to want that, and Katara will make use of this as we go forward. So, yeah, they meet Lao and Poppy Beifong here, And this is mostly kind of similar to the original. They kind of slightly extend out like the kind of dialogue discussing business a little bit more, because they have a better sense for, I think, what the Beifongs are about after all the development that's happened and stuff like that. And yeah, this is when the Beifong daughter arrives, Toph Beifong, and so yeah, this is the reveal that the blind bandit is Toph Beifong, and this is going to set up the awkwardness at the dinner. And yeah, at the dinner, yeah, it's Toph and Aang interacting as Sokka and Katara talk to kind of Poppy and Lau. Some of the business stuff is somewhat interesting, as like Katara gets them their supplies for the refugees by offering the portrait of Aang. The Beifongs inquire about natural resources in the Southern Water Tribe, which feels very kind of north and south kind of comic coded a little bit. And yeah, the Aang Toph dynamic is as you would expect. He doesn't fully know that she's keeping it a secret, and she's trying to get that across without just spoiling her whole thing. And yeah, the end result of this is that she earthbends a message to Aang on the ground, meet me in the garden tonight. So this is a kind of reveal that this version of Toph can kind of like do that. She can just like use earthbending to raise up the characters on the ground, and she can kind of write in that sense. So that's all pretty cool. And yeah, I think this scene is like pretty solidly done. They make a little bit more of a, I think, job to maybe even out the dialogue between Lau and Poppy, and that like Poppy's actually the more noted of the parents in this version of the show, whereas it's more Lau in the show and the comics. But what are your thoughts on the full Toph introduction here?
Yeah, no, I think it's the family dynamic is interesting, especially considering where we know it sort of like ends up later on. But yeah, I don't know. I thought it was interesting that Poppy was the one that was more of the sort of, in charge of the family, more matriarch compared to what we sort of have seen before here. But I think, just the fact that they're a family that has been involved with Avatar's past is sort of a interesting thing. And I kind of like that sort of aspect to it, because it makes it, makes it have a little bit more sort of, history and meaning that Toph is sort of supporting the Avatar. So that's sort of like, okay, there's sort of like a thing here of, their family and the Avatar, even if it is, probably, maybe a little bit sort of like surface level on the end of some of these relationships, but there's something there in the past, and that's sort of what the family is sort of known for, that and sort of their business connections and their dealings, which they do sort of mention a good bit here, which is, need to see how their sort of like, business knows no borders and how that gets played out sort of later on in things. So I think, it's interesting to see the dynamic of the family and how that later on, plays into Toph directly and how she views her parents and just her family, and how, not respectful or respectful she views they are of, what she wants to do in the future here. So no, I thought this was a good way of seeing sort of the sort of lady version of Toph and how she sort of wants people to, or at least how people are perceiving her before, she reveals her sort of true self here.
We cut back to Zuko and Faye. So they talk. This is where Zuko sees that she has a burn on her leg, and you really clearly see that, like, okay, this is Song kind of folded into some of the kind of Zuko alone family dynamic a little bit here. She tells Zuko the story of her day her parents were killed, and also she was burned. Zuko listens to this with intently, as he kind of hears this story from someone of, this is the effect the Fire Nation, your nation, has on me, and he kind of finally listens, I suppose, to it and what he takes away from this. She says to him that he doesn't need to be ashamed of his scar, because again, her assumption is that he's Earth Kingdom and was scarred by the Fire Nation. Zuko gets emotional and walks off, and while he does walk off, the soldiers arrive to grab Faye, so he kind of goes back. I suppose the context of this as well, he goes back and kind of beats them up, but this happens off screen basically. So yeah, this is I think pretty nice. Again, this is the Song stuff rolled into the Zuko alone stuff, but I think it's really effective. They kind of continue this, I suppose, a little bit of an arc with the scar, where like they expand on this in the Zuko Katara scene as well. So I sort of like some of that stuff where they just kind of emphasize it like a little bit more. But yeah, this is, I think, pretty good, this scene. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, no, I think, it's something for Zuko to really sort of understand the perspective of other people in terms of, what the Fire Nation has done in the past and sort of the pain and turmoil that they've caused and how, it doesn't really, it conflicts with his sort of, worldview of the Fire Nation and sort of what he wants to be about, in the future here. Because if he did get the scar from being sort of like, an Earth Nation citizen and stuff like that, then, it would have a whole different sort of meaning for what he has on it, in terms of like the shame and the pain and everything like that. So it definitely, forces him to think about, everything in sort of different way, which I think is, the point of what they're doing sort of here. But I like this.
Back to the flashback, Ursa and Ozai discuss Zuko. She praises Zuko for his want to help people, but Ozai says that he lacks strength. Ursa says that strength is sometimes knowing when not to fight, but he basically is just like, no, I'm not going to nurture him. We can't be like that, not in this kind of world, in this family. Zuko needs to be stronger. And basically the idea of that, the line he says is like, if he can't put his like younger sister in her place, she will take his place. And that's the whole thing. Might is the main focus of everything going on here. And that's what he wants to nurture, is the two of them fighting to be the best. That's what he wants. He then says there's a greater destiny for the kids. And he notes Ursa's strong bloodline. She gave him an heir and a spare. And Ursa is taken aback because of the mention of heir, given that Iroh's alive. He has a son, Liu Ten. They're next in line for the throne, not us. So what are you talking about? This is that kind of stronger destiny he's talking about. She then says that she won't let Ozai turn them, the kids, into monsters. He's like, is that what you think of me? And he kind of confronts Ursa. We're left to kind of wonder what exactly happens here. This is, in this version of the show, the first kind of sign of like that, okay, Ozai's this very kind of like domineering character, but here's the first sign of like abuse, basically, kind of like within the relationship, as we kind of end the scene. And Zuko is watching this as well. So that's kind of an interesting kind of point here. So yeah, this one's mostly like, this feels very similar to kind of the original, but some of the dialogue seems to imply that rather than, oh, the Ursa family was sought out specifically by like a Zulon for the lineage, it was more so maybe more of a noble thing. They're maybe going for more maybe the initial original pre the search intent of Ursa, where it maybe was more of just a joining of noble houses type thing, which is kind of interesting. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting the differences and just thinking how they're sort of tweaking the relationship between the dynamic of them. But, it does feel by the end of it, it's just sort of like, Ozai becomes this sort of, caricature monster, sort of evil-ish type character that we're sort of used to, who has sort of the idea that, he knows what's best for the Fire Nation and that he's going to lead them towards, their eventual sort of like, supreme sort of future, even though Iroh's, clearly not out of the picture right now. But that's sort of the terms that he's thinking of. And, it's interesting that this is all playing out during sort of the time where, Zuko needs to sort of like stand up for, what he wants to believe in, or, something that he needs to have courage for that he, wasn't really sort of, or that he was trying to show before, but he got knocked down for showing for it. So this time when we come back from the whole sort of, flashback here, we can see that he did sort of do what might have been sort of the better thing and stand up for the situation and didn't sort of run away from a conflict.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we come out of that. Zuko's hands are bloody. He has fought off the soldiers, and Faye helps him to clean the wounds on his like knuckles from fighting. So there's at least right now they don't do the thing where like he kind of reveals his firebending in the middle of one of these fights. We'll get to that. Next scene is we have the Toph and Aang talk where she can be more open. She's not interested in teaching him, but he does, before he kind of leaves, is like, hey, can you at least give me some explanation on how you do your neutral jing, how you earthbend? She explains that she ran away from home, she learned from the badger moles, they were blind like her. Earthbending is how both of them interact with the world, and so that is how Toph learned to earthbend. She talks about vibrations, the significance of like connection with earthbending. Aang interestingly asks her then if she ever visits the badger moles who taught her. And she explains that that happened near their house in Gaoling and that they don't go there anymore. Aang is kind of saddened by this because if he, couldn't constantly talk to Appa, that would be a really, really bad thing. So he kind of wishes she could have a similar relationship with her animal friends. He wouldn't know what he would do if he ever lost Appa. So that's a setup for, in this version of the show, much, much, much later on. But yeah, there's that. And then she reveals her parents don't want her to bend, that this is part of the reason why they left Gaoling, was to kind of separate her from that like source or training of her bending. But she does seem to note that like they are just trying to protect her. She's kind of going along with that kind of family line, but like that's the kind of whole idea there. Aang says that you can be yourself with the team, but she says that there are expectations on her because she is a Bei Fong and she can't stray from them. Aang connects to her because he has similar burdens of being the Avatar, both something they both didn't choose but sort of have to be. But he notes that even though he's on this path, this was the path where he kind of met his two best friends on, and talks positively about his journey. And this makes Toph smile because I suppose what could be if she was to join up. He respects her decision and walks off, and yeah, he hopes that she gets to see those badger moles again. So it's the core of what it is in the original. Again, slightly expanded out to emphasize the burden of being a Bei Fong, again because this show, just from context later on, having that hindsight, knows better what being a Bei Fong kind of means. And then I actually like the badger mole stuff being brought up a little bit early here, and the almost setup that like I hope that pays off and she gets to see them again, which is kind of interesting because like technically in the original they use badger moles to kind of clean the arena in Earth Rumble, but they don't do that here. But that's just an interesting point here. So yeah, I think this is pretty nicely done. The Toph stuff I think is very, very solidly done. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
I would agree that the Toph conversation here, I think, it feels like they had the benefit of hindsight here, and they were able to expand out sort of the role of just the Bei Fongs in general, and just sort of how they work in this sort of world and their sort of prestige that they have as their, sort of like nobility business leaders in that sort of regard here. I mean, Toph seems to understand and is more sort of, mature and not sort of as, sort of, outspoken against what she's sort of being forced to do. And I don't know if that's more because she's sort of learned, bending more on her own without any sort of, connection with her family, sort of training her just so that she can sort of understand the basics and sort of protect herself, or if there's, another sort of angle here. But overall, I like the sort of, connection point that, these two characters have, and sort of understanding or the expectations of their roles in society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the only issue I have with this scene is just, I think visually, they missed opportunities to kind of maybe show a little bit of that Toph and the Badger Moles flashback, because they're taking that from like a much later episode, that part of Toph's backstory, and placing it here, where they do actually show a little bit of that flashback. And they obviously don't, I guess, for like budget reasons with the CG. But also when she explains her kind of vibration connection thing, I think they maybe could have like done some kind of zooming in, kind of showing a little bit more of this. At the very beginning of this scene, they show like a little bit of seismic sense as she does like one bit of earthbending to Aang, but then it feels like, okay, we're done. We're just having a dialogue scene. So I just think like visually they could have broken it up a little bit better, but it gets the point across. Next, Zuko overhears from Peng that the Avatar is in Kudi Village as we jump back into the flashback. This time we get, again, something quite different here. Ursa wakes up Zuko in a hurry. She already has Azula with her, and she says that they need to go quickly. She gets them into a carriage, and they're about to make their escape from, I guess, the palace, from the Fire Nation. Azula shouts about where her father is. This alerts the guards as they're trying to kind of quieten her down. They're stopped, and Ursa in this moment kind of knows what's about to happen. They're not going to get away. She knows she's going to be blamed for this, and so she says her goodbyes to her children. She gives, I think she gives Zuko the swords, the two swords. She gives her ring to Azula, and she gets to hug both of them goodbye. It's very kind of evenly done here. And the two kids watch as Ursa is dragged away by Fire Nation guards. So this is a pretty kind of notable change where like the kids know very directly, I suppose, why their mother was taken away, banished. That's the one thing that they kind of don't quite reveal here, what exactly happened to her. But they know she was taken away, and they guess didn't really see her again after this moment here, because she tried to take them both away from Ozai so they wouldn't be monsters. In terms of setup for the future, this is interesting because it seemingly takes away at least some of the dynamic with Ursa and Azula, because Azula has that ring that her mother gave her in the same way that she gave something to Zuko. They were both here in the scene. They will reference, though, the idea that Azula got them caught. Azula prevented something different from happening with them. And that's kind of interesting, but that's in a later episode. So, again, it's certainly interesting, especially when we know the full story, basically, of this now. I think it's just intriguing that they chose to very much just do something, like, completely different here. Obviously, we have to wait and see how it kind of pans out to see how it goes, but it's just like, okay, that's solid and interesting, and I'll see how it goes. What are your thoughts on this kind of changed, like, Ursa says goodbye kind of moment?
I mean, it feels like it's one of those things where it's in response to a lot of people's ideas that, one was favored over the other. So in this instance here, they're making it sort of a more of a balanced goodbye to sort of, smooth out those edges, and, sort of, it could have both been, good characters, or, not as sort of, uneven as, we see them sort of later on in either iterations of things. I don't know if I completely, is on board with that, because, from what we've seen of current day Azula, whatever happened with her between this point in time to where we see her later on with, Ozai sort of raising her, she's clearly has, doesn't have any of the sort of, I don't know, underlying compassion that we would say Zuko sort of has. So, clearly before this point, there was already some things that were sort of tweaked there, and she is the one to speak out about what's going on, where is Dad. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it's good that Ursa tried to take both of them and does give them both a token to sort of remember her by, but the end result is still the same. She's sort of taken away. Both of the children know directly that something happened to their mother, even if Ozai covered up exactly what happened, or sort of explained it away or something like that. I do wonder if we would get sort of that specific sort of answer in terms of what exactly happened after this sort of moment here. But regardless, we can see the end result of how the two children sort of ended up in their relationship with each other versus the father and stuff like that. So it definitely is quite a departure for them to make. I'm curious to see if it really sort of plays out as well as they hope it intends to.
Yeah, and then the timeline stuff I brought up earlier on is kind of interesting, because does this mean like Ursa does anything in relation to like Ozai ascending to the throne? Mainly when it comes to like, Azulon dying, where we actually need someone to take over. So obviously in the original, it's like Ozai has Ursa make the poison for him that he then uses to, silently, without anyone knowing, take out Azulon. And then the whole idea of Iroh doesn't really turn up, interact with the family because of the death of Luke 10, so he just takes over. The way they kind of framed it here earlier is that, like, based on what Zuko says, is that, you didn't do anything while he took over, so in what way did he take over? So, like, because there's a few years, I guess, between, like, that event and this event, like, is she just held in prison and then he maybe comes to her at a key moment? Or, yeah, is she straight up, like, banished from this point now? That's kind of interesting because, like, one of the big parts of Zuko Alone is, like, that it ends on the moment of, like, Ozai is now Fire Lord and, like, this is my life type thing for Zuko. I'm in a bad situation now. Whereas it doesn't go that far here, which I think is kind of, that's one of the impacts, I think, of Zuko Alone, is that, like, it ends on that moment of, like, this is when this family becomes the royal family and so on. The other thing is, with the ring, the fact that she has an item for both kids. The swords, of course, for Zuko makes a ton of sense with the whole Blue Spirit connection. And Zuko has them. He will continue to use them as we go forward. That's fine. I'm glad it was the swords, I guess, and not maybe the mask, just because that might have been a little bit weird. But the ring for Azula, I'd have to watch a lot of the later episodes again, but I don't believe she wears the ring. And I don't remember seeing a scene where she alludes to it or, like, they show it with her. So I'm guessing they're saving this for sort of the fall from kind of grace, loss of control stuff that will happen later on with her, where we'll more address Azula Ursa. But what way do you think they'll go about, like, using the ring, I suppose, with Azula at this point?
Something with her either breakdown or some other sort of connection with her mother that we see later on when they're having, like, conflict as, like, a family or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I could definitely, well, maybe not in this version, but I could see her using that in some way to sort of manipulate Zuko in terms of, what's going on in whatever situation. Like, that feels like something that I would sort of expect from her. I don't know. It's odd because I'm trying to sort of, understand, like, her connection to her mother and how much, that sort of affects her later on, or even just from when she was younger. Because, I mean, we know from the other one, the other series or show, we can see sort of, like, how that affected her mentality and what she sort of thought of her mother. Like, we just did the beach episode recently. So, like, we have that sort of idea. But in here, it seemed like they were trying to make it seem like they were, generally pretty even in their sort of, relation with the mother here. I don't know if that's true, and maybe there'll be some other scenes that sort of contradict that. But that's sort of the feeling that I get that they're sort of trying to go for.
Mm-hmm. We as we come out of this, we highlight that Zuko is in fact heading for the village, so he is going to go after Aang. We then cut to Sokka and Suki talking, so they actually have more of a dynamic happens here. Sokka says that Suki has too much positive jing. She might be too reckless. She's a little bit confused because, I'm the leader of the Kyoshi Warriors. I'm leading them into battle. I can take care of myself. He's worried because she nearly got killed by the serpent. He gets kind of emotional, thinks she's kind of like dismissing his concerns, and kind of wants to move on kind of quickly. She then kind of like sort of senses what's going on here and is kind of like, hey, did anything happen to you in the north? And she brings up how, like, Aang and Katara have talked to me about, like, what they went through in the north, but what about you? And this is where, again, he can't bring himself to talk about Yue. So it's one of those ones where, like, I think the scene is actually quite good. It's just like, it's maybe getting a little bit repetitive at this point in time, the amount of scenes that just end with, like, Sokka just, like, clamming up on this one topic. And it will continue until, like, episode 3. So it's just a bit like, I understand wanting to extend it out a little bit much, but there's not much to this kind of plot necessarily. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I don't know, because I do, like the conversation that they have here and him sort of expressing his concern for her. Like, I think that's all good. I don't know. I wonder if it would have been better if they just did that over the course of multiple episodes and that sort of culminates into something, and then that sort of makes more sense rather than doing it, in such a short period of time, which, I don't know, I guess it's weird because, if we think of this episode, in terms of, like, 3 different parts, then it's like, okay, yeah, maybe it makes sense that this would come up a couple of times, especially since this course of, over a period of time. But, all in one go, in one sort of watching, you notice the patterns more, which is, just sort of unfortunate about how they do it, in this sort of episode here. But, I think that the core of it, I do like, them having this sort of conversation and this sort of connection here, and him just talking about positive Jing and stuff like that. And it's a nice way to bring that back into the situation.
Um, so yeah, they then spot Mei and Ty Lee and they have a fight. So Sokka gets taken out immediately by Ty Lee. He just gets heavily chi blocked. He's basically like fully paralyzed. Suki faces Mei and Ty Lee 2-on-1, gets a bit overwhelmed, and is at risk until Katara arrives to kind of turn the tides. Ty Lee chi blocks Katara, so we get the debut of like blocking bending here, but she's not like fully chi blocked her, so Katara just like clenches her fist and punches Ty Lee straight in the face, which is a pretty funny moment because she's just fully not expecting a bender to just give the physical attack. But then, yeah, Appa arrives and this kind of wins the day, basically. They quickly figure out that, we need to get back to the village. They're here after Aang, obviously. We need to go kind of support him. So, yeah, cool scene. It definitely highlights, I suppose, even though Sokka's kind of a better fighter now compared to where we started off with, Suki is still on like a whole other level to him. So I do appreciate that. And yeah, this is, I think, pretty solid stuff overall, what we do here. I think G blocking was nicely done here. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this fight scene here? Mostly non-benders here until right at the end.
Yeah, no, I thought this was good. I think it flowed pretty well. We got to see, their abilities. We got to see the teamwork of Ty Lee and May. I like their sort of, combination fighting together here. I think, it's really cool. I guess, I don't know, it feels like, before May was more sort of just like, throwing projectiles, but here we get to feel, more of her sort of like hand-to-hand combat skill prowess. So I do appreciate that they're sort of showing that here. And yeah, Katara just sort of, punching randomly is definitely something that seems out of the norm, but I guess, we established earlier that now she knows how to throw a punch, which I think is, is cool. I think it works well for her to have, more than that ability. So I think later on in this series, that becomes a bit sort of much of her being sort of like a good sort of non-bender, but right here, I think it's totally fine the way that they sort of set this up and her sort of initially trying to use the bending and having to sort of fall back on something. But yeah, I think, this feels pretty much like on par. Like, Sokka's good at fighting, but he's not quite that good yet, depending on the situation. And also just, Ty Lee and May are just, extremely skilled. So it kind of makes sense.
Uh, in Kuti Village, Zuko finds Aang, goes to confront him, but Azula appears and they have a conversation. So, she's like, hey, you don't have to capture the Avatar anymore. Ozai wants you home. Your banishment is over. Zuko, of course, can't believe this. We're basically doing this is from the Avatar state. This is from the first episode of the animation, basically, but we're doing it a little bit later here without some of the same context. But it's still in essence that scene is happening here. And yeah, we get to the idea. Azula will bring Zuko home no matter what Zuko wants. Zuko won't go back until he has the Avatar and moves out to attack Aang. So we get this three-way standoff then. Azula, Aang, and Zuko. And this is where we get the full kind of meeting of Azula and Aang. We get the whole, do you not see the family resemblance kind of scene here. Azula calling Aang a little boy does feel a little bit odd given the time skip kind of between the things here, and that like he doesn't look like that much younger than her. And that's just a bit odd, but we just get the kind of fight here. It's mostly, I think, pretty solid here. They knew, I think they had something kind of strong here, which is all the main characters for the chase scene at the end. So the build up to it is, I think, pretty well done. Also, and yeah, the Zuko bit at the start with Azula, it's pretty functional. It gets across like their initial interaction. It's fine. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the start of this sequence here?
Yeah, no, I think the start of this is good. I think, this almost feels more like, sort of the typical Azula, like, sort of manipulating the situation because she knows Zuko probably won't believe him, even though she is sort of telling the truth. But, maybe she's just trying to sort of say what she was told to say here, but I think it works towards what she it makes sense towards like what a manipulating Azula would sort of think in this sort of situation where Zuko can't abide with anything that she says here in order for him to sort of continue on his goal in the fight here. So no, I think the sight of the start of this fight is pretty good. Other than the little kid line, which I don't know. I feel like throughout the course of the season, there's like a couple lines where they're like feels like they're beholden to the original source. Where in this case, I would hope that they like wouldn't be that sort of attached to the source and they would do something different. It's funny. It's like we want them to be close to the original, but we want them to be sort of their own thing because things are different in this series. So it's I don't know. It's a hard choice, and maybe there's no perfect solution for that. But otherwise, the initial setup for the fight here, the three-way standoff, I think is pretty good. Right before they get into the action of everything.
Relatively early in the fight, we do get the kind of moment where Zuko's just firebending and then notices that Faye and Peng are right there and have just seen him firebend. So this will be more of a setup for the end of this whole sequence. But he's distracted seeing them, and this allows Sokka to appear and kind of like temporarily knock Zuko out of the fight. This then results in kind of Team Avatar kind of like fully appearing here. It's 4-on-1, then Toph arrives, and then it's like 5-on-1. Iroh then arrives to help Zuko, then becomes like 7-on-1. She actually fights Team Avatar 5-on-1, like they kind of have that sequence go on while Iroh arrives. And it's only when Iroh properly arrives that she kind of puts up the hands to kind of partially kind of retreat, like she's actually at a disadvantage. But she does the kind of classic thing of like feigns surrender and then attacks Iroh with lightning and leaves. So yeah, this is all pretty accurately done to kind of the way it kind of happens before. So in the main difference here is that like we have Suki with us still, which is actually kind of a cool thing to have. And then yeah, in the aftermath of this, the team does want to help Iroh, but Zuko scares them off. That's the kind of main way things happen here. So yeah, this is all cool. Like I do think the moments where they kind of pan the camera around and like you have the music hitting and it's like, oh look, it's Team Avatar. Here's the 5 members of Team Avatar. It is a cool moment when it happens, and there is some nice kind of action as we kind of go through this as well. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the chase basically happening?
Yeah. No, I think the overall setup and everything for this is pretty good. I think the action that we get to see here, all of our characters having sort of like at least one sort of like highlight moment here. Basically, this whole part of the town, village, whatever, being completely sort of destroyed and up in flames. I think they do a good job of showing sort of the destructive power of firebending or just bending in general. I think they do a good job of showing that something that we might not have seen as much in animation because of how animation is done, but here we get to see sort of like environmental sort of changes of them sort of bending in this sort of arena here. So no, I think this was pretty good, and getting to see sort of everyone sort of fighting against Azula here and using her abilities and just sort of how she uses sort of lightning bending in general in this season, or just how she uses it, period. It's pretty cool to see. It's definitely sort of different from what we have seen before, which I can appreciate that in terms of what they're sort of going for here. So no, I think this was pretty cool to see how everything sort of panned out.
So Toph has apparently joined the team. Aang's happy to have her here, but Poppy arrives to try and get her back. She thinks Toph is in danger. She's still delicate, but Toph's like, I'm not a flower, I'm a rock. This is who I am. And they kind of go back and forth a little bit, but Poppy, of course, won't listen. So yeah, Toph just walks off with the team being like, I'm never going to wear shoes again, because she doesn't get that Toph finds it better to not wear shoes. So yeah, Toph has joined the team, and this is, in essence, the way they do it in the original as well. It's just some of it doesn't happen off screen like it does there. We then have Peng confronting Zuko, who's carrying Iroh, calling him a firebender in front of everyone, and he carries the injured Iroh away. I will say that given how strong this plot, I think, was over the course of the episode, this has the kind of like final scene is rather like what's the word here I'm trying to say here? It's a bit just like tame. It's just like, okay, it happened. Okay, it was kind of emotional, but like Zuko's just like, I feel like I don't get much emotion maybe from Zuko out of the way they chose to showcase this, but again, they're having to be a little bit quicker paced with some of this stuff. It's not awful, but yeah, what are your thoughts on these two scenes?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess he was just sort of like resigned to the fact that, if this comes out, that he would sort of be, not appreciated in any sort of sense here, which is essentially what he said to Iroh when he, first sort of left him, right? Like, if people knew who you are, they wouldn't be so, nice to you. So I guess, he's, at least at this moment, he's okay with that. Like he's, that, he's just focused on Iroh's health and everything like that. So I guess that sort of, it definitely doesn't have the impact as what we've seen before, but it goes along the lines of what we have seen currently. And yeah, with Toph, I think, it makes sense that she would just sort of be like, I'm out of here. Like she's not going to do anything like recklessly, confrontational or crazy or anything. She's just going to go about her business and do what, she thinks is now, going to be in her sort of best interest.
Mm-hmm. And then the last scene of the episode is that Poppy and Lau send the Boulder and Ji Shen after Toph to try and get her back. So this is a full like character replacement here. It's not Xin Fu and Master Yu. It's the Boulder and Ji Shen. Now, we also sort of have to, I suppose, acknowledge here is that this plot point, at least in terms of the Boulder and Ji Shen, only goes as far as like one scene, I think, at the start of the next episode. Before they place the importance back on Poppy, I guess, trying to get her back. It's interesting because it feels a little bit like, okay, like they kind of have to do this plot point, but then they really don't have the time to maybe fully commit to it, and then they kind of know they're going to do it slightly differently in the end. I think most of the thing I have coming out of this is just that I still hope they have the Boulder kind of have his kind of redemption when it comes to the invasion, whatever they do with season 3, if they're doing that. I'd hate for like this Boulder's last scene in this version of the show for him to just be a villain, kind of like placed in the Xin Fu position, because I've always liked that kind of aspect with the Boulder, that like he actually is just loyal to the Earth Kingdom and actually has a good relationship with Toph, and this is kind of slightly changing that. But otherwise, because they didn't do the whole Master Yu thing, replacing him with Ji Shen is okay, and using the Boulder instead of Xin Fu is okay. It's just that, like, yeah, you see that, like, they're sort of constrained by, like, oh, we kind of have to do this, but we don't maybe want to do this. There's a weird one here where this is just one of those, it's okay plot points. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I don't know if there could have been a better way. Because, I mean, they just, in Earth Rumble, they just didn't have the massive characters that we had in the animation, which is, probably just a limit of what they could do, casting, budget, whatever wise. So there's not a pool of them to pick from. And, it doesn't irk me that too much that these are the two characters that they use for it. I think it's unfortunate that we don't do more with them, but I don't know. Yeah, I guess it does kind of feel like they sort of like had to do this, but I almost would be, more appreciative if they just sort of cut them. Like there was no, like, because the mother has such an importance later on with, getting Toph back and stuff like that, they should just use the mother, more in this. Like, I would think you could still keep like the attendant there, because he would be the one to sort of like, support the mother who's going out on her own. Like, usually they don't have, sort of women in the situation sort of like unattended by anyone, or at least a servant or something like that. So, it could make sense that him and the mom is sort of like out there, and maybe the dad's there running the business, or whatever combination they want to do with it. So I don't know. I almost feel like that would have been better than to just have the Boulder in there and not do anything more with him, in this season. Like, maybe he'll come back later on and he'll have a redemption thing, but I don't know. I don't know if there's enough sort of camaraderie there in order for him to come back or anything like that. I don't know. It's interesting, but it does feel like this is one of the times where they were sort of like, they felt beholden to the source, where as other times they didn't feel that.
Yeah, because thinking about kind of what happens in Toph's plot, and that, like, yeah, they could have like altered stuff like in future episodes, like the whole Toph blackmail plot, and like that could have been like Poppy and the family from a distance, like trying to force her to do something, and that's her kind of solo plot in Bossing Say, and that doesn't work, so she comes in person, and we get the metal bending kind of setup moment. That could have worked, and yeah, you don't need to do the whole we're sending these two after, because yeah, they don't build to she gets to metal bend and kind of like dominate these two in this version of the show, so it's interesting. But yeah, they're the first two episodes. Like we kind of said, it's mostly kind of fine. It's just there are kind of like frustrating moments of kind of adaptation, and we'll get to the other episodes as we do kind of further episodes. Again, hopefully we'll be able to do all that before Comic-Con hits and potentially big Avatar Studios stuff. So we need to kind of get through this. But yeah, that's been episode 306 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye.